In a climate-controlled vault 3 kilometers beneath the surface of Antarctica, a drill bit touched something impossible in December 2018. The ice here was ancient compressed snow that fell when mammoths still walked the earth. But at 1,084 meters down, embedded in frozen darkness that had known no sunlight for over 100,000 years, the drill encountered water, not frozen, liquid, moving. Lake Mercer had been sealed beneath the weight of empires, beneath the entire written history of human civilization, yet its waters flowed in absolute darkness, following channels carved when Antarctica was green. When the drill finally pierced through, sensors detected currents, temperature variations, a hidden hydrology operating by rules the surface world had forgotten. 6,000 miles north, in a different vault, this one temperature-controlled, dim, smelling of ancient clay, a curator at the British Museum slides open a drawer. Inside, wrapped in acid-free tissue, lies tablet BM 78941. The clay is the colour of desert sand, its surface covered in wedge-shaped impressions made by a reed stylus sometime around 1800 BCA. The tablet speaks of waters beneath the world, of a realm called the Abzu, where the god Enki dwelled in subterranean darkness, governing fresh waters that fed all the rivers and springs of the earth, of a time before a great flood, when knowledge was preserved by those who knew catastrophe was coming. 2 archives, one frozen beneath Antarctic ice, one baked hard by the fires that consumed ancient Sipar 4,000 years ago, both describing waters hidden beneath the surface of the world, both preserving memory across timescales that dwarf individual human lives. The Sumerian texts, pressed into wet clay before being filed in temple libraries, speak repeatedly of the Anunnaki, beings described not as myths or legends, but as teachers, judges, decision-makers, beings who possessed knowledge from before the flood that reshaped the world. The tablets describe this knowledge in technical precision, measurements, procedures, astronomical observations, irrigation engineering. They describe it as inherited, not invented, received, not discovered. Antarctica, according to geological cores drilled through its ice, was once radically different. The continent that now holds 70% of Earth's fresh water locked in ice sheets up to 4.7 kilometers thick was, 34 million years ago, covered in forests. Rivers flowed through valleys now buried under masses of frozen water heavier than mountains. Then something shifted. The climate changed with geological violence. Within a few 100,000 years, a blink in deep time, the continent transformed from temperate to terminal. The ice came, and everything beneath was sealed away. Here is what the Sumerian tablets say, translated from cuneiform impressed into clay at the city of Sipar during the Old Babylonian period. When the gods instead of man did the work, bore the loads, the god's load was too great, the work too hard, the trouble too much. This is from tablet BM 78941, discovered during excavations conducted by the British Museum in 1889. The text continues with remarkable procedural detail, describing not the creation of humanity through divine breath or mystical transformation, but through a process involving clay, blood, and what the text calls the essence of a god who has intelligence. The tablet refers to Enki repeatedly. Enki, whose realm was the Abzu, specifically defined in Sumerian as the fresh water that exists beneath the earth, feeding springs, wells, rivers, and lakes from some hidden source below the surface. Enki, whose title, Lord of the Earth, referred specifically to what lay beneath the visible world. The text described the Abzu in geographic terms, as a place, with temperature, depth, darkness, not metaphorical, physical. In 1996, Russian scientists drilling at Vostok Station in East Antarctica discovered Lake Vostok, a subglacial body of water the size of Lake Ontario, sealed beneath 4 kilometers of ice. The lake has been isolated from the surface for at least 15 million years. Since then, over 400 subglacial lakes have been mapped beneath Antarctic ice using ice-penetrating radar. They form a vast network, some connected by rivers that flow upward against gravity, driven by the pressure of the ice above. A hidden hydrological system beneath a frozen world, operating in perpetual darkness, its waters fresh despite being entombed in ice. The parallel is striking, not proof, parallel. The Sumerians described subterranean waters as the source realm of pre-flood knowledge. Antarctica hides beneath ice a landscape that existed before the freeze, rivers, valleys, perhaps coastlines now unreachable beneath masses of frozen time. If you're listening to this late at night, wherever you are in the world, take a moment to comment where you're hearing this from, not for the algorithm, for the shared sense that this mystery, this question of what lies preserved beneath surfaces we cannot easily penetrate, connects us across distance and time. The Sumerians asked these questions. We're still asking them. What if the Sumerian texts aren't describing mythology? What if they're describing memory? What if something about how we understand the preservation of knowledge across catastrophic change is incomplete? The tablets are specific about one thing. The Anunnaki possessed knowledge from before the world was reshaped by water, knowledge they transmitted carefully through systems designed to survive. The cuneiform texts themselves are such a system, clay that would be baked hard by the very fires that destroyed the cities, ensuring the words would outlast the civilization that wrote them. An archive that preserves itself through catastrophe. Antarctica is another such archive, flash frozen in geological terms, preserving beneath kilometres of ice whatever existed before the freeze. Core samples drilled through Antarctic ice capture atmospheric bubbles from 800,000 years ago, offering a breath of ancient air, chemically unchanged, waiting in darkness to be released into modern laboratories and measured. Two systems of preservation. One intentional clay tablets stored in temple libraries, one accidental, a continent transformed into a deep freezer by climate forces beyond human control. But both operating on the same principle: if catastrophe comes, what you want to preserve must be encoded in a medium that survives the transformation. The title Anunnaki appears in Sumerian texts from the earliest periods. It means literally those who from heaven to earth came, not metaphorically. That's what the cuneiform says. The Sumerian king list, inscribed on a clay prism now housed in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, the Well-Blundell Prism, catalogue designation WB, dated to approximately 1800, states this plainly. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in eridu, descended, not evolved, not gradually developed, descended, transferred. The list then names 8 kings who ruled before a great flood, with reigns measured in tens of thousands of years. The text treats these durations as administrative fact, recording them with the same bureaucratic precision used for later kings whose archaeological existence is confirmed. No mythology marker. No indication the scribe considered this section different in nature from the historically verified sections that follow. The Eridu Genesis, preserved on tablet CBS 10673 at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, describes the warning given to Ziusudra before the flood, not by divine vision or dream, but through a reed wall. Enki, unable to break an oath, sworn to the divine council not to warn humanity directly, speaks to a wall, knowing Ziusudra stands on the other side. The text gives the dimensions of the boat to be built, specific measurements, construction techniques, a preservation protocol disguised as mythology. When the flood came, according to these texts, it lasted 7 days and 7 nights. When it ended, Ziusudra made offerings, and the text says, they gave him life like a god and preserved him in the land of Dilmun, the place where the sun rises. Preserved. That word again. Not rewarded, not elevated. Preserved. What if preservation of knowledge before catastrophe isn't mythology? What if it's the entire point? The Antarctic ice preserves everything beneath it with absolute fidelity. Organisms found in Lake Mercer samples included ancient bacteria, crustaceans, and genetic material from species that existed before the ice came, frozen, dormant, but not destroyed, waiting in darkness, encoded in DNAR, which is itself a preservation system, a chemical library storing instructions across deep time. The Sumerian tablets preserve knowledge in wedge-shaped impressions pressed into clay with such precision that after 4,000 years we can read them. The language is dead. The civilization is gone. The cities are mounds of sand-covered rubble. But the words remain, exactly as written, waiting in museum drawers. Instructions, measurements, names, procedures, memories of what was preserved when something else, some prior arrangement, ended. 2 archives, both beneath surfaces, both preserving information from before a transition that changed everything, both waiting to be read. The question the Sumerian texts ask over and over in different ways is not where did we come from? The question is, what do we remember from before the flood, before the ice, before the forgetting? The tablets say the Anunnaki taught, they transmitted, they preserved systems of knowledge through human intermediaries who would encode it in clay, in temple rituals, in king lists and creation accounts, and technical manuals disguised as myths. They did this knowing, according to the texts themselves, that catastrophe was cyclical, that water would rise, that civilizations would end, that everything depending on memory alone would be lost. So they used clay, and we, reading it now, use ice, drilling down through layers of frozen time, extracting cores that tell us what the atmosphere was like when the tablets were being written, what it was like long before, what patterns repeat across timescales longer than nations. If something existed in Antarctica before the ice, some inhabitable coastline, some temperate valleys now crushed beneath geological weight, would we know? Could we know, without drilling through kilometres of ice that would collapse the caverns, melt the preservation, destroy the very archive we seek to read? The Sumerians faced this problem in reverse. They knew fire would come, so they used clay that fire would harden. They knew time would bury cities, so they buried the tablets deliberately in foundation deposits, in temple archives, in layers that would wait until some future digger broke through the sand and found them, still readable, still precise. Both systems acknowledge the same truth. If you want knowledge to survive, you must encode it in what the catastrophe cannot destroy. This script will explore that parallel carefully, tracing the Sumerian texts that describe waters beneath the world, knowledge from before the flood, the Anunnaki as preservers of systems too precise to be pure invention, examining the geological evidence of Antarctica's transformation from inhabitable to frozen, looking at the question of how knowledge moves across catastrophic breaks in continuity, not to prove anything, to explore what the evidence suggests, to honour the mystery by taking it seriously. The tablets are real, the Antarctic ice is real, the hidden waters beneath both are real. What memory they preserve is the question that pulls us forward. When kingship descended from heaven, in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, in a climate-controlled case designed to slow the decay of ancient clay, sits an object the size of a forearm. It's a prism, four-sided, covered entirely in columns of cuneiform text, tiny wedge-shaped impressions marching in ordered rows from top to bottom. The clay is reddish-brown, the colour of fired terracotta. The catalogue designation is WB, and it represents the most complete surviving version of a document called the Sumerian King List. The prism was discovered at the site of ancient Larsa in what is now southern Iraq, part of a collection assembled by Herbert Weld Blundell during excavations in the early 20th century. It dates to approximately 1800 BC, though it records information the Sumerians themselves considered far more ancient. The document is not mythological, it's administrative, a record of rulers, their cities, and the length of their reigns, compiled by scribes who treated this as bureaucratic necessity, essential for establishing political legitimacy and the proper sequence of royal authority. The text begins with a phrase that has echoed through scholarship for over a century after the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, descended, not emerged, not developed, not evolved from tribal chiefdoms through social complexity into urban administration. Descended from heaven to Eridu. The word used is Sumerian, an meaning heaven or sky. The word translated as descended is ed, which means specifically to go down, to descend from a higher place to a lower place. The grammar is unambiguous. The scribes who compiled this text, working in the old Babylonian period, with access to archives we no longer possess, treated this as the factual beginning of kingship in Sumer. Then the list does something that has troubled historians since George Smith first translated these texts in the 1870s. It names 8 kings who ruled before the flood, and it gives the length of their reigns. In Eridu, Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. Alalha ruled for 36,000 years. 2 kings, they ruled for 64,800 years. The text continues. Eridu's kingship ended, and the kingship moved to Bad Tibera. In Bad Tibera, Enmen-Luana ruled for 43,200 years. Enmen-Galana ruled for 28,800 years. Dumuzid the shepherd ruled for 36,000 years. 3 kings, they ruled for 108,000 years, on through 5 cities. 8 kings total. The sum of their reigns, 241,200 years. Then this line, the flood swept over. After the flood, the text continues with more kings, but now the reigns are shorter, centuries instead of tens of millennia, and eventually dropping to lengths that match archaeological evidence. Gilgamesh, whose historical existence is confirmed by contemporary inscriptions, is listed as ruling for 126 years. Still legendary, but within the realm of biological possibility if we allow for exaggeration or confused chronology. The kings after him have progressively more realistic reigns, eventually matching exactly with dates confirmed by other sources. This structure, impossibly long antediluvian reigns, followed by gradually normalizing post-diluvian periods, presents an interpretive problem that has never been satisfactorily resolved. The mainstream scholarly position is that the antediluvian section represents myth or symbolic numerology, while the later sections represent history. The transition between myth and history supposedly occurs at the flood, but the text itself makes no such distinction. There are no markers indicating a change in genre. The scribe uses identical formulas for both sections: name, city, length of reign, total, the same bureaucratic precision, the same matter-of-fact tone. If the antediluvian section is mythological, the scribe shows no awareness of this. It's recorded as administrative fact. The numbers themselves follow patterns. The reigns are multiples of 3,600, which in Sumerian mathematics was written as a special unit called a sar, literally the totality or the universe. Some scholars suggest this indicates the numbers are symbolic, representing cosmic ages rather than literal years. Others point out that the Sumerians had sophisticated mathematical systems and may have used different year lengths in the distant past, or recorded time in different units that were later misunderstood as years. A third possibility is rarely discussed in academic contexts, but is worth examining. What if the numbers preserve a memory of a different timescale, a different way of measuring duration that referred not to individual reigns, but to dynasties, cultures, or epochs? What if Alulim ruled for 28,800 years meant something like the system represented by Alulim persisted for 28,800 years, where the king's name stood for a political or cultural continuity rather than a single human life? The Sumerian king list exists in multiple versions, found at different sites. The Weld Blundell Prism is the most complete, but fragments have been discovered at Nippur, Susa, and other locations. All versions include the antediluvian section. All versions use the same formula. All versions treat these kings as the beginning of the sequence, essential context for understanding everything that came after. What's particularly striking is that other cultures in the ancient Near East preserve similar traditions. The Babylonian priest Berossus, writing in Greek in the 3rd century BC, recorded Mesopotamian history and included a list of 10 kings who ruled before the flood, with reigns ranging from 10,800 to 64,800 years. His source material was Babylonian temple archives, now lost. The Hebrew Bible preserves a parallel in Genesis chapter 5, which lists 10 generations from Adam to Noah with lifespans ranging from 365 to 969 years, still impossible by modern biology, but notably shorter than the Sumerian versions. This pattern of extreme longevity before a flood, followed by gradually normalizing lifespans afterward, appears in enough independent sources to suggest it preserves some genuine tradition, even if the literal numbers are not historically accurate. Something about this structure, golden age of vast duration, catastrophic disruption, gradual recovery, encoded itself deeply in the memory of multiple cultures. The Eridu mentioned as the first city is not mythological. The site has been excavated. Tel Abu Sharain in southern Iraq contains the archaeological remains of Eridu, including temples that date to the Ubaid period, around 5000 BC, making it one of the oldest cities in Mesopotamia. Pottery fragments, foundation walls, and temple platforms remain. The city the King List calls the first seat of kingship after heaven actually exists. The phrase "after the kingship descended from heaven" uses the Sumerian word Namlugu, which means specifically the office or function of kingship, not just a king. It refers to the institution, the system of royal authority, as if kingship itself were a technology or organizational method that could be transferred, taught, or implemented. This is consistent with how the Sumerians generally describe the origins of civilization. In multiple texts, they attribute the fundamentals of urban life, writing, law, irrigation, temple architecture, mathematics, astronomy, not to gradual human invention, but to divine instruction. The gods, particularly Enki and Inanna, are credited with teaching these arts to humanity. The Mi, a Sumerian word without exact English translation, referring to the fundamental principles or divine decrees governing civilization, are described as already existing, then transferred to human cities. The Epic of Gilgamesh, in its Sumerian versions, describes Gilgamesh's journey to Ziusudra, the flood survivor, who in the King List is called Ziusudra of Shuruppak, last of the antediluvian kings. Gilgamesh seeks from him the secret of eternal life, but what he receives instead is an account, a testimony. Ziusudra describes the flood, the warning he received, the construction of the boat, the survival of the deluge. He has become, the text says, like the gods in that he does not die, but his immortality is explicitly connected to his role as preserver, the one who carried forward knowledge from before the catastrophe. The King List treats Ziusudra as historical. He appears in the same formula as later kings. Ziusudra became king, he ruled for 36,000 years. One king, he ruled for 36,000 years. The flood swept over. After that line, the flood swept over, there is a spatial break in some versions of the text. Then, after the flood had swept over, and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. That phrase again. The kingship descended from heaven. Not just once, at the beginning, but a second time after the flood. As if the institutional knowledge of how to organize a kingdom, how to administer cities, how to maintain the apparatus of civilization had to be reintroduced because the flood had disrupted the continuity of transmission. This is not how myths typically function. Myths provide explanation, origin stories, symbolic meaning. They don't usually include bureaucratic detail about the re-establishment of administrative systems after environmental catastrophe. But that's exactly what the Sumerian King List does. It treats kingship as a transferable technology that required re-implementation after the flood broke the original continuity. Texts like the Eridugenesis and Atrahasis, which we'll examine in detail later, describe what happened during the flood and immediately after. Those texts emphasize preservation, saving seed stock, animals, craftsmen, specialized knowledge. They describe the flood not as divine punishment, but as something debated in council, with certain gods opposing it and taking steps to ensure survival. The emphasis is on continuity despite disruption. Archaeological evidence from Mesopotamian shows repeated cycles of flooding, abandonment and rebuilding. At sites like Ur, Kish, Shuruppak and Lagash, excavators have found layers of water-deposited sediment separating occupation levels, sometimes several meters thick, suggesting major inundation events. These flood layers don't all date to the same period, suggesting the flood remembered in Sumerian tradition might be a composite memory of multiple catastrophic floods over centuries. But something about one particular event seems to have marked a cultural discontinuity significant enough that later scribes dated everything to it. Before the flood, after the flood, the boundary between impossibly long rains and progressively more realistic ones. The point at which, according to the texts, kingship had to descend from heaven a second time because the original transmission had been interrupted. Leonard Woolley, excavating at Ur in the 1920s, discovered a flood stratum 3 meters thick, separating Ubaid period remains from later early dynastic material. He believed this was evidence of the biblical flood. Later analysis showed this layer dated to around 2900 BC and was geographically limited. A massive flood, yes, but not global, yet significant enough in the Mesopotamian river valleys to reshape settlement patterns and leave a mark in cultural memory. The Weld-Blundell prism preserves that memory in administrative format, not as story, but as list, not as explanation, but as record. 8 kings before, then water, then kingship re-established, then history continuing in unbroken sequence down to the period when the scribe was writing. The precision matters. Names are given. Cities are named. Rains are recorded in exact numbers, not vague long-time formulations. The text claims to know exactly how the sequence unfolded. It presents this knowledge as preserved fact, transmitted across the catastrophic break, surviving in some form, whether oral tradition, earlier written records, or temple archives, until it could be inscribed into clay and baked hard. The question is, what kind of event could produce this specific pattern in the textual record, legitimate memory of pre-catastrophe systems, catastrophic disruption, preservation of institutional knowledge, re-implementation afterward, and bureaucratic documentation of the entire sequence as unbroken administrative history. The tablets don't speculate, they record. 8 kings, impossibly long reigns, 5 cities, then flood, then resumption. Modern scholarship tends to extract the useful parts, the historically verified kings, and treat the antediluvian section as legendary contamination of an otherwise valuable source. But this approach assumes the scribes who compiled the list couldn't distinguish between myth and history, that they carelessly mixed genres without awareness. An alternative reading, the scribes recorded what the temple archives contained, knowing it to be ancient, not fully understanding the meaning of the vast chronologies, but preserving it because preservation of institutional knowledge was their primary function. The archives they worked from may have been copies of copies transmitted across centuries, possibly millennia. The original meaning of the large numbers may already have been lost, but the numbers themselves were preserved with exactitude because that's what scribes do. They copy precisely, even when they don't fully understand. If kingship is treated as a system of knowledge, a technology of social organization, then its descent from heaven might be less metaphysical and more procedural. Heaven, in Sumerian cosmology, was where the gods dwelled. The gods, according to every Sumerian text that discusses them in operational detail possessed advanced knowledge. They understood agriculture, metallurgy, astronomy, mathematics, law, architecture. They taught these things. The transfer of knowledge from those who possess it to those who don't, across a hierarchical gap, is what teaching is. After the kingship descended from heaven might simply mean after the system of organised rule was taught to human populations by those who already possessed it. Who possessed it? According to the texts, the Anunnaki. Who were the Anunnaki? The texts describe them as judges, decision makers, beings associated with the oldest cities, present before the flood, surviving after it, maintaining continuity. The name itself, those who from heaven to earth came, describes a movement from one place to another, a descent exactly parallel to the descent of kingship. The Sumerian king list doesn't explain this. It records it. The kingship descended. It was in Eridu. Alulim ruled. Then Al-Aljar. Then the sequence continues until the flood interrupts it. Then the kingship descends again. It's in Kish. The sequence resumes. The document ends in most versions in the early 2nd millennium BC when the scribe was working. But the beginning, the anchoring point, is always the same. After kingship descended from heaven, it was in Eridu. That's where human urban civilization begins, according to Sumerian memory. Not gradually, not from scattered villages slowly coalescing, by descent, by transfer, by teaching. The archaeological site of Eridu shows no evidence of gradual development either. The Ubaid period temples there appear sophisticated from the earliest levels. The architecture is already organised around central courtyards, with standardised brick sizes, complex buttressing patterns, and decorated facades. This sophistication doesn't evolve through visible stages at the site. It appears in the earliest excavated layers, suggesting either it was imported from somewhere else, or earlier developmental stages lie deeper, unexcavated, or were located at sites we haven't found yet. The king list preserves the name of that first king, Alulim. No other contemporary evidence confirms his existence. But the name itself is Sumerian, grammatically consistent with other Sumerian names, and means something like the leader stag or the strong deer. It's not a god's name. It's presented as a human ruler who held an office that had been transferred to humanity from another source. The text states simply, he ruled for 28,800 years. Then the next king ruled for 36,000 years. Perhaps these numbers are symbolic. Perhaps they're corrupted. Perhaps they refer to something other than years. But they're not random. They follow mathematical patterns. They're precisely recorded. And they're part of a document that transitions seamlessly into historically verified information. Whatever the antediluvian section represents, myth memory, misunderstood chronology, or something else, it was important enough that every version of the king list preserved it. Scribes copying this text in different cities across several centuries all kept these names, these numbers, these impossible reigns, because in their understanding, this was where kingship began, after it descended from heaven, after the Anunnaki taught it, after something transferred institutional knowledge to humanity in the city called Eridu, at the edge of the marshes, where fresh water emerged from the ground, and the boundary between land and water was uncertain, the first city, according to the text, according to the archaeology, the place where, before anything else, the kingship descended, the Abzu, waters beneath the world. The Sumerian word Abzu appears in texts from the earliest readable period of cuneiform writing. It's written with two signs, Ab meaning water, and Zu meaning deep or far, together deep water. But in Sumerian cosmology, this wasn't metaphorical. The Abzu was a specific place with specific characteristics, described with geographic and physical precision across hundreds of texts spanning 2,000 years of Mesopotamian literary tradition. The Abzu was the realm beneath the earth where fresh water originated. Not the ocean, that was Abba, salt water, the domain of the goddess Tiamat in Akkadian tradition, or Namu in Sumerian texts. The Abzu was specifically fresh water, subterranean, the source from which springs emerged, wells were dug, Rivers were fed during dry seasons when surface rainfall failed. The Sumerians, and later the Babylonians and Assyrians, believed, because observation of their environment suggested, that fresh water existed in vast quantities below the surface, accessible through wells, but originating in some deeper hidden network. This was not primitive ignorance. This was empirical observation of actual hydrology. The Mesopotamian plain sits above a massive aquifer system. Wells dug to sufficient depth encounter water tables fed by rainfall absorbed in the Zagros Mountains to the east and the Armenian highlands to the north. That water percolates through porous rock and emerges at springs, feeds the Tigris and Euphrates even during seasons when no rain falls, and creates the marshes of southern Iraq, where the boundary between land and water becomes ambiguous. To a Sumerian farmer or priest, observing this system without knowledge of modern hydrology, the most reasonable explanation was that fresh water existed beneath the earth in vast underground reservoirs or channels, and what emerged at the surface was merely access points to that hidden system. The Abzu was their model of the hydrological cycle's underground component, not metaphysical but physical. Real water in a real place that happened to be inaccessible except at points where it broke through to the surface. The god associated with the Abzu was Enki, called Ea in Akkadian. His name in Sumerian, Enki, means Lord of the Earth, specifically the earth in the sense of soil, ground, the solid matter beneath the surface, as opposed to an heaven or sky. Enki's domain was below. His temple at Eridu was called E-Abzu, the Abzu house. Texts describe him dwelling there, in the deep waters, in darkness, in a place of coolness and stillness. The geography is consistent across texts. Enki's realm is described as cool, a marked contrast to the heat of the Mesopotamian surface. It's dark, no sunlight penetrates there, it's still or has slow movement, not the rushing of rivers, but something more steady. The water is described as sweet, fresh, life-giving. These are not characteristics of the ocean. These are characteristics of deep aquifers or subterranean lakes. One of the clearest descriptions comes from Enki and the World Order, a Sumerian composition preserved in multiple manuscripts from the Old Babylonian period. The text describes Enki's role in organizing the cosmos after creation, and it includes this passage, translated by the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature. Enki, the king of the Abzu, overpowering in his majesty, speaks up with authority. Father Enki, who holds steadfastly the divine. Powers, whose house is founded in the Abzu, a pure place. The house of Eridu, which juts out into the sea, where the shadow falls beautifully. The Abzu is described as having a house, the E-Abzu temple, and that house is founded there, suggesting it was built to give access to the Abzu rather than being metaphorically located there. Eridu itself juts out into the sea, which matches its actual geography. The ancient site was located where fresh water from underground sources mixed with the salt marshes of the Persian Gulf coast. Another text, Enki and Ninmar, describes the creation of humanity and includes this description of Enki's realm, the one of great wisdom, the creator of all the senior gods. Enki lay on his bed, not waking up from his sleep, in the deep Engur, in the subterranean water, the place which the interior of the gods did not know. The word Engur is another term for the Abzu, emphasizing its depth and mystery. The phrase "the place which the interior of the gods did not know" suggests even divine beings found this realm difficult to access or understand. It was Enki's specialized domain, requiring specific knowledge to navigate. The texts consistently associate Enki with secret knowledge, with wisdom, with crafts and technical skills, with magic understood as applied knowledge of natural principles. He is called the patron of scribes, metalworkers, builders and magicians. His gift to humanity, in text after text, is not physical strength or military prowess, but understanding how things work, how to shape materials, how to organise systems, and his realm is beneath the surface, in fresh water, in darkness, in coolness, in a network that feeds the visible world from below. Now turn attention to Antarctica. Beneath the Antarctic ice sheet, which covers 98% of the continent and averages 1.9 kilometres in thickness, reaching up to 4.7 kilometres at its deepest points, lies a hidden landscape. This landscape includes mountain ranges, valleys, and over 400 subglacial lakes, mapped using ice-penetrating radar and satellite measurements of minute changes in the ice surface elevation. These lakes exist in perpetual darkness. The temperature of the ice above them is minus 55 degrees Celsius at the surface, but at the base of the ice sheet, pressure and geothermal heat from the earth below create conditions where water remains liquid. The ice acts as insulation, and its immense weight, up to 2.5 million kilograms per square metre, creates pressure that lowers the freezing point of water, allowing liquid to exist at temperatures that would normally produce ice. The largest of these lakes is Lake Vostok, discovered beneath Russia's Vostok Station in East Antarctica through seismic surveys conducted in the 1960s and 70s, then confirmed through ice-penetrating radar in 1996. Lake Vostok is roughly the size of Lake Ontario, 250 kilometres long, 50 kilometres wide, with depths reaching over 500 metres. It contains an estimated 5,400 cubic kilometres of water. It has been sealed beneath more than 4 kilometres of ice for at least 15 million years, possibly longer. The water in Lake Vostok is fresh. Despite being covered by ice accumulated over millions of years, despite being under immense pressure, the lake contains fresh water, likely originating from melting at the base of the ice sheet, where geothermal heat and friction from ice movement produce liquid water. This water is extremely cold, around minus 3 degrees Celsius, but remains liquid due to pressure. The lake is in complete darkness. No photosynthesis has occurred there for millions of years, yet it exists, a vast reservoir of fresh water hidden beneath ice, inaccessible except through extraordinary technological effort. Lake Mercer, drilled in December 2018, revealed similar conditions on a smaller scale. At 1,084 metres below the surface, the drill broke through into water that had been sealed for over 100,000 years. The water was fresh, cold, dark, and contained living organisms, bacteria, crustaceans, and genetic material from tardigrades and nematodes. Life, dormant or persisting in slow metabolic states, preserved in cold darkness beneath the weight of ice. The subglacial lakes aren't isolated. Ice-penetrating radar has revealed channels connecting some lakes, forming a network where water flows despite being beneath kilometres of ice. Some of these flows move against gravitational expectation, driven by pressure differentials created by the weight of the ice above. Water from one lake can drain through subglacial channels to another lake dozens of kilometres away, refilling over years or decades in cycles that operate on timescales completely divorced from surface weather or seasonal patterns. In 2023, researchers using satellite data and radar mapping discovered evidence of an ancient landscape preserved beneath the East Antarctic ice sheet, a network of valleys and river channels that existed before the ice came, carved by flowing water when Antarctica was temperate. These features have been frozen in place for over 34 million years, preserved exactly as they were when the climate shifted and ice began accumulating. Rivers that once flowed to the sea, now buried beneath ice nearly 3 kilometres thick, their courses still traceable through radar mapping of the bedrock topography. The parallel to the Abzu is conceptually striking. The Sumerians described a realm of fresh water existing beneath the surface, hidden, cool, dark, the source from which surface waters emerged. Antarctica's subglacial hydrological system fits this description precisely. Fresh water beneath the surface, hidden, cold, dark, feeding nothing on the surface now, but representing a vast reservoir that existed before the surface conditions changed. The Abzu was described as the place where knowledge from before the flood was preserved. Enki, dwelling there, possessed understanding of principles that predated human civilization. He was the keeper of the me, the fundamental organizing principles, the knowledge that enables. His realm was inaccessible to ordinary people, but priests and initiates who approached correctly could access the wisdom stored there. Antarctic ice cores function as archives of atmospheric conditions dating back 800,000 years, nearly 1 million years of climate history preserved in frozen water. Bubbles of ancient air trapped in ice layers provide direct samples of Earth's atmosphere at the time the snow fell. Analysis of these bubbles reveals carbon dioxide levels, methane concentrations, temperatures, volcanic activity, and even cosmic dust from supernovas. The ice preserves memory with chemical precision. The organisms found in Lake Mercer, dormant in cold water beneath kilometres of ice for 100,000 years, carry genetic information that predates modern human civilization by orders of magnitude. Dinar is a storage system, biological cuneiform, encoding instructions for building complex structures, compressed into molecular form, readable by those with appropriate technology. The Sumerians would not have known about Dinar, ice cores, or subglacial lakes, but they lived in an environment where fresh water emerged from underground sources that sustained life in an otherwise harsh climate. They observed that this water came from somewhere below, somewhere hidden, somewhere that operated by principles not immediately visible on the surface. They formalized this observation into a cosmological model where the Abzu, the deep fresh water, was fundamental to existence, and the god who understood its principles was the keeper of knowledge. If the Sumerian texts are read not as primitive attempts at science, but as preservation of observed patterns encoded in mythological language, the Abzu becomes less about literal belief in an underground ocean, and more about recognition that hidden systems beneath the surface sustain visible life. And understanding those systems requires specialized knowledge transmitted across time. Enki is described in numerous texts as the god who warns the Asudra or Atrahasis or Utnapishtim, depending on the version about the coming flood. He did this despite having sworn an oath to the divine council not to warn humanity. His solution, described in the Eridu Genesis, was to speak to a reed wall, knowing a human stood on the other side. He couldn't warn directly, but he could allow knowledge to be overheard. This is a pattern. Throughout Sumerian and Akkadian texts, Enki is the god who finds loopholes, who transmits knowledge indirectly, who ensures information survives even when direct transmission is forbidden or impossible. He preserves. He enables continuity. His methods are procedural, not miracles but techniques, systems that work if you understand the principles. The flood in these texts is described as water rising, not just rainfall, but the Abzu itself overwhelming the surface, the boundaries between the underground water and the surface world breaking down. In Atrahasis, the flood is triggered by opening the dikes of the Abzu, allowing the subterranean waters to surge upward. If the Abzu represents the aquifer system, this describes what geologists call artesian flooding, when underground water pressure becomes sufficient to force water to the surface through fissures or springs, creating floods that don't depend on rainfall. This phenomenon occurs in Mesopotamia during earthquakes or when river levees break, allowing surface water to interact with the water table in ways that flood entire regions. But the texts treat the flood as unprecedented, as world-changing, as requiring divine intervention to trigger. Something about its scale or suddenness was beyond ordinary flooding, and afterward the world was different. Kingship had to descend again, systems had to be re-established, knowledge had to be transmitted anew from those who preserved it through the catastrophe. Enki's role consistently is as the preserver and transmitter. He knows what's coming. He ensures survival. He passes forward the understanding needed to rebuild. And his realm, the Abzu, the deep fresh water beneath the surface, is where this knowledge is secured. When Antarctic ice cores are extracted, brought to the surface and analysed in laboratories, they provide knowledge of conditions that existed before modern human civilization, before cities, before agriculture, before any historical record. The ice preserves what would otherwise be lost, actual samples of ancient air, actual chemical signatures of extinct ecosystems, actual evidence of climate patterns that operated according to principles invisible from the surface. The Abzu as conceptual framework, knowledge hidden beneath the surface, requiring specialised access, preserved in a medium that survives surface catastrophes, maps onto what Antarctica has become, an archive of deep time, inaccessible without extraordinary effort, preserving information from. Before the world changed, the Sumerians didn't know Antarctica existed. They didn't know ice could cover a continent. They didn't know about subglacial lakes, or ice cores, or genetic preservation in frozen environments. But they understood, from observing their own environment, that fresh water beneath the surface was fundamental, that knowledge could be stored in hidden places, that understanding required accessing sources not immediately visible, and that catastrophes could be survived if the right information was preserved in the right medium. They called that hidden realm the Abzu. They associated it with the god who possessed knowledge from before. They built their first city where access to that realm was clearest, Eridu, where the fresh water emerged, where the temples stood over the point, where the hidden became visible. And they recorded, in cuneiform impressed into clay, that this was where kingship descended, where knowledge was transferred, where human civilization began, not through gradual invention, but through transmission from those who already possessed it. The texts don't explain the mechanism, they record the pattern. Fresh water exists beneath the surface. Knowledge exists in hidden places. Access requires understanding principles not immediately obvious. Preservation requires appropriate medium. Catastrophe tests what survives. Antarctica's subglacial lakes, preserving fresh water in darkness beneath ice for millions of years, fit the pattern the Sumerians described in terms available to them. Both systems emphasize the same principle: what you cannot see still operates. What survives beneath the surface may be more important than what's visible above, and understanding requires going deep. The Eridu Genesis, First Flood Account. Tablet CBS 10673, housed in the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, is one of the most damaged and most important Sumerian texts ever discovered. The clay tablet is fragmentary, approximately 1/3 survives, with the remaining portions lost to erosion, breakage, or the 4,000 years the tablet spent buried in the ruins of Nippur before excavation teams from the University of Pennsylvania unearthed it in the late 19th century. What remains is tantalizing and frustrating in equal measure. The tablet preserves portions of what scholars call the Eridu Genesis, the Sumerian account of creation, the early cities, and the flood. It's older than the Babylonian Atrahasis, older than the flood account in Gilgamesh, older than any biblical text by well over a millennium. This is the earliest known version of the story in any language, written in Sumerian cuneiform during the Old Babylonian period, but preserving traditions the Sumerians themselves considered ancient. The surviving portions of CBS 1673 begin with an already ongoing narrative. The very beginning of the text is lost, but what we have describes a time after creation, when the gods have established the first cities, but before humanity exists in its current form. The text names 5 cities: Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larsa, Sippar, and Shuruppak. It assigns each city a protective deity. It describes kingship descending from heaven and being distributed among these urban centres. Then the tablet describes a problem. The text is damaged here, but the surviving lines suggest that humanity has become numerous and noisy, disturbing the gods. The god Enlil, head of the Divine Council, proposes to reduce humanity through catastrophe. Other gods debate this decision. The text emphasizes disagreement within the divine assembly. This is not unanimous divine will, but a contested decision, with different gods having different concerns. Enki opposes the plan. His opposition is not recorded in the surviving portions of CBS 673, but parallel accounts in later texts make clear his position. Humanity should be preserved because they serve a function, maintain the temples, perform labour that allows the gods to rest. Destroying them entirely would be counterproductive. But Enki is outvoted or overruled. The decision is made to send a flood. What happens next is one of the most procedurally specific passages in Sumerian literature. The surviving text describes Enki approaching Ziusudra, who is identified as a king and as the one who fearfully guarded the divine ordinances. This description is crucial. Ziusudra is characterized not by military strength or wealth, but by his maintenance of proper procedures, his adherence to divine instructions, his role as keeper of traditions. Enki has sworn an oath not to reveal the plan directly to humanity, so he employs a technique that preserves the letter of his oath while violating its spirit. He speaks to a reed wall, knowing Ziusudra is on the other side. The text, in the fragmentary form that survives, includes these lines. Standing at its side, he spoke to the reed wall. Reed wall, reed wall, wall wall, hear well and pay attention to my words. The text then describes specific instructions for building a boat. The dimensions are damaged in the surviving portion, but references to making it equal in measure and providing it with a roof suggest technical specifications rather than vague guidance. The purpose is stated clearly: to preserve life through the coming catastrophe. This is where the Eridogenesis distinguishes itself from later versions. The emphasis is not on moral judgment. Ziusudra is not selected because of exceptional righteousness, though he is described as reverent, but because of his functional role as maintainer of proper procedures. The flood is not divine punishment for sin, but a solution to a practical problem: overpopulation and noise. The preservation is not miraculous rescue, but technical preparation. Build the boat correctly, stock it appropriately, survive the duration of the catastrophe. The boat is not symbolic. The text treats it as an engineering project. Later versions, particularly the Babylonian Gilgamesh Tablet C, provide extraordinary detail. A cube-shaped vessel, 120 cubits on each edge, built with 6 decks dividing it into 7 levels, corked with bitumen inside and out, with compartments for different categories of beings and supplies. The specifications are so precise that modern naval architects have analysed whether such a vessel would actually float and remain stable. Their conclusion, yes, though it would be nearly impossible to steer and would function more as a survival barge than a ship. The Eridogenesis doesn't preserve those construction details, but the structure of the narrative emphasizes procedure over miracle. Ziusudra is warned in advance. He is given time to prepare. He is instructed in specific techniques. He follows those instructions. The preservation succeeds not through divine intervention during the flood, but through preparation before it. The flood, when it comes, is described in meteorological and temporal specificity. The surviving text states, for 7 days and 7 nights, the flood swept over the land. Not 40 days, as in the biblical account. 7 days. A specific duration. This detail appears consistently across all Mesopotamian versions. 7 days and nights is the standard duration for the deluge itself. The description of the flood emphasizes wind as much as water. All the windstorms of enormous power, they all came together. The flood swept over the cult centers. Wind and water together suggest not just heavy rainfall, but a storm system of extraordinary violence, possibly a hurricane-force cyclonic event combined with storm surge, which in the flat Mesopotamian river valleys could produce flooding that seemed to cover the entire known world from the perspective of someone experiencing it. When the waters recede, Ziusudra's first action is described in procedural detail. He makes an opening in the boat, not waiting for a dove or raven as in later versions, but actively creating ventilation and light once the violence subsides. He performs sacrifices, offerings to Utu the sun god, demonstrating both that the storm has ended, the Yun is visible, and that proper religious procedure continues. The preservation was successful. The continuity is maintained. What follows is one of the most striking passages in Sumerian literature. The gods, specifically Anun-Enlil, the highest deities, approach Ziusudra and speak to him directly. The text says they gave him life like a god, they brought down for him eternal life like a god. At that time, because of preserving the animals and the seed of mankind, they settled Ziusudra in a land, the country of Dilmun, where the sun rises. The phrase they gave him life like a god uses the Sumerian Nam Til, which literally means the state of living or life quality. It doesn't say Ziusudra became a god, but that he was given life condition comparable to gods. Specifically, he doesn't die in the normal way. He is settled in Dilmun, a place described in other Sumerian texts as a kind of paradise, pure and bright, where sickness and death don't exist. But the key phrase, often overlooked in analysis, is the reason given, because of preserving the animals and the seed of mankind. The immortality or exceptional longevity granted to Ziusudra is explicitly connected to his function as preserver. He carried forward the biological continuity, the animals, the seed, and because of this preservation, he is himself preserved. The reward matches the action. He ensured life continued, his own life continues, beyond normal limits. The text breaks off shortly after this. The remaining portions of CBS 1673 are too fragmentary to reconstruct, and no duplicate manuscripts preserve the ending. We're left with an account that begins in the middle, describes the flood and survival, and then ends abruptly with Ziusudra transported to Dilmun. What we have, though, is enough to establish the pattern that repeats across all Mesopotamian flood accounts: advance warning through indirect means, specific technical instructions, emphasis on preservation rather than escape, successful survival through preparation, restoration of proper, religious procedures afterward, and reward that functions as continuation of the preservation principle. The Eridu Genesis doesn't present the flood as unprecedented cosmic battle between order and chaos, as the Babylonian Enuma Elish does. It doesn't frame it as moral punishment for human wickedness, as Genesis does. It presents it as a decision made by divine administrators to address a problem, opposed by at least one dissenting god who takes steps to ensure continuity despite the catastrophe, resulting in successful preservation of what needed to survive. This is bureaucratic language applied to cosmic catastrophe. The flood is a policy decision. The preservation is procedural compliance. The survival is technical success. The reward is administrative recognition of proper function. This tone, matter-of-fact, procedural, administrative, is consistent across Sumerian texts dealing with the pre-flood world and the immediate post-flood restoration. It's not the language of mythology in the sense of dramatic storytelling, symbolic imagery, or moral allegory. It's the language of institutional record-keeping, of documenting what happened and how systems were maintained through disruption. Archaeological excavations at the sites named in the Eridu Genesis, Eridu, Bad Tibera, Tel Larsa, Sippar, Shuruppak, Tel Farah, have confirmed these were real cities with occupation sequences extending back to the late Ubaid and early dynastic periods, roughly 5000 to 500. Beak. Flood strata have been found at several of these sites, particularly at Shuruppak, where excavations by Harriet Martin and others revealed a layer of water-deposited sediment separating earlier and later occupation levels. The flood layer at Shuruppak dates to approximately 2900 BC. It's several metres thick in places, indicating a prolonged inundation, not just seasonal river overflow. Above and below the flood stratum, the material culture shows continuity in pottery styles, architectural techniques, and administrative practices. The city was flooded, abandoned temporarily, and then reoccupied by people using the same cultural traditions. Continuity despite catastrophe. Preservation through the break. The Eridu Genesis, as preserved on CBS 1673, might be the textual equivalent of that archaeological pattern. It documents catastrophe and continuation. It emphasizes the mechanisms by which knowledge and life are preserved through disruptive events. It records in administrative language that such preservation is possible if approached correctly, with advance warning, technical preparation, proper execution, and maintenance of institutional memory. The tablet itself is one of those preservation mechanisms. Clay impressed with reed stylus, dried, then baked hard, either intentionally in a kiln or accidentally in the fires that destroyed Nippur multiple times over its long history. The words pressed into clay 4,000 years ago remain legible. The story they tell of how knowledge and life survive catastrophe through preparation and procedure is itself surviving through the medium the Sumerians chose for preservation. CBS 10673 is fragmentary, much is lost, but what remains is precise. Ziusudra preserved the animals and the seed. The gods recognize this preservation. He was himself preserved. The text doesn't explain why preservation matters cosmically, it simply records that it does. The flood came. Preparation was made. Survival occurred. Continuity was maintained. The pattern is documented. The mechanism is described. The outcome is recorded. And 4,000 years later, archaeologists extract the tablet from the ruins of Nippur, and scholars read the surviving lines, and the story persists exactly as the story says such things can persist if encoded in appropriate medium, following proper procedures, maintained across catastrophic breaks in transmission. The tablet is evidence of its own thesis. Preservation is possible. Memory can survive. Knowledge can cross the flood if you know how, if you prepare, if you use the right medium, if you follow the procedure. The Eridu Genesis, inscribed on CBS 10673, is the instruction manual. Incomplete, but still readable, still teaching, still preserving. Atrahasis, the exceedingly wise. In 1889, archaeologists excavating at the site of ancient Sippar, about 30 kilometres southwest of Baghdad, uncovered 3 clay tablets that would fundamentally change scholarly understanding of Mesopotamian flood traditions. The tablets, catalogued as BM 78941 and BM 78942 at the British Museum, contained a Babylonian epic written in Akkadian cuneiform during the Old Babylonian period, approximately 1800 BC. The text they preserved was called, in its own opening line, the story of Atrahasis, the exceedingly wise one. The Atrahasis epic is longer and more detailed than the Eridu Genesis. Where CBS 16673 preserves fragments, the Sippar tablets provide substantial continuous narrative, though still with significant gaps and damaged sections. What survives, however, is remarkable for its procedural specificity and its framing of the flood story within a larger narrative about the creation of humanity, the purposes for which humans were made, and the tensions this creates within the divine hierarchy. The epic begins not with humanity, but with the gods themselves, engaged in hard labour. The opening lines, preserved on BM 78941, describe a time before humans existed, when the lesser gods, the Ijigi, were forced to dig irrigation canals, dredge rivers, and perform the exhausting physical work necessary to maintain the infrastructure of civilization. The text states this directly. When the gods instead of man did the work, bore the loads, the gods' load was too great, the work too hard, the trouble too much. This is not creation through divine speech or mystical emanation. This is a labour problem. The gods, organised in hierarchical fashion with the Anunnaki as senior administrators and the Igigi as workers, face a crisis of productivity. The work required to maintain agricultural systems in the Mesopotamian environment, constant irrigation, canal maintenance, flood control, silt removal, is described as backbreaking and endless. After 40 years of this labour, the Igigi rebel. The rebellion is described in surprisingly modern organisational language. The Igigi gather in assembly. They appoint a spokesman. They march to the house of Enlil, the senior administrator, and they burn their tools. The text says they set fire to their tools, fire to their spades they put, and flame to their work baskets. This is strike action. The workers have withdrawn their labour and destroyed the instruments of production. The divine hierarchy faces a crisis that cannot be resolved through force. You cannot compel exhausted workers to perform precision agriculture. The solution must be systemic. Enlil summons the council of senior gods, the Anunnaki. The problem is presented. The Igigi will not return to work. The necessary labour is not being performed. The system is breaking down. Enki, as he does consistently across Sumerian and Akkadian texts, proposes a solution. Create a new category of being specifically designed to perform this labour. Transfer the work from gods to a created species that will fulfil the function without the political complications of divine workers striking. The proposal is accepted. What follows is one of the most unusual creation accounts in ancient literature. The goddess Nintu, also called Belet Ili, Ili of the gods, is summoned as the birth goddess. Enki provides technical specifications. The text describes a process that involves clay and blood, specifically the blood of a slaughtered god mixed with clay from the Abzu. The god chosen for slaughter is named Wei-Ila, described as having intelligence or ghost. The Akkadian word Timu can mean both. The text is explicit about why this particular god is selected. He possesses the quality needed for the creation. He is killed in the assembly of the gods. His blood is mixed with clay. Nintu shapes this mixture into forms. The creation is described as requiring specific procedures, incantations, and a gestation period during which the forms develop into functional human beings. This is not metaphorical. The text treats it as a manufacturing process. Raw materials, divine blood/Essi, technical procedures, incantation, gestation, and quality control. The goddess oversees the process to ensure proper results. The outcome is humanity, beings that possess enough intelligence to follow instructions and perform complex labour, but who are mortal, physically limited, and subordinate to the gods. 14 humans are created initially, 7 male, 7 female, to serve as breeding stock. They are described as being placed in service to the gods, specifically to perform the agricultural labour the Igigi refused to continue. The system functions. The fields are maintained. The canals are dug. The cities are supplied. The gods, relieved of physical labour, rest. But the experiment has an unintended consequence. Humans reproduce. Successfully, rapidly. The text says the land became wide, the people became numerous. Within 1200 years, a number the text specifies exactly, humanity has become so numerous that they make noise continuously. Their activity, their voices, their presence becomes overwhelming. Enlil, attempting to rest, cannot sleep because of the clamour. What happens next is described as a series of attempted solutions. Enlil first sends plague to reduce the human population. Enki intervenes, teaching humanity medical procedures to treat the disease. The population recovers. Enlil then sends drought, cutting off the rains. Enki intervenes again, teaching irrigation techniques and access to the Abzu waters. The population survives. Enlil escalates, famine, more severe drought, blockage of the underground waters. Each time, Enki finds ways to preserve humanity, though the text implies significant suffering occurs. Finally, Enlil proposes the ultimate solution, a flood that will eliminate humanity entirely. This time the Divine Council agrees, and all the gods swear an oath not to warn humanity about what's coming. Enki is bound by this oath. He cannot speak directly to any human. The text then describes Enki's solution, preserved on the second tablet, BM 78943. He summons Atrahasis, who is described as his devoted servant, a man who daily brings offerings to Enki's temple. The relationship is characterized as one of reciprocal duty. Atrahasis serves Enki faithfully, and Enki has obligation to his faithful servant. Unable to speak to Atrahasis directly without violating his oath, Enki employs the same technique described in the Eridu Genesis. He speaks to a wall, specifically a reed wall of the house where Atrahasis sleeps. The text preserves his words: reed wall, 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 hear well and pay attention to my words. Dismantle your house, build a boat. Abandon property, save life. The boat you build, roof it over like the Abzu. Let it be equal in dimensions. Cover it with a roof. The instructions that follow are extraordinarily specific. The boat should be roofed over like the Abzu, covered, enclosed, not open-topped like ordinary riverboats. It should be equal in dimensions. The later Gilgamesh version specifies a cube, 120 cubits, on each side. It should be caulked with bitumen inside and out to ensure waterproofing. It should contain multiple decks to separate different categories of cargo. Then come preservation instructions that read like inventory procedures. The seed of all living creatures bring into the boat. The boat that you build, its structure must be well designed. Let it be covered over above and below. Atrahasis builds the boat exactly as instructed. The text describes him gathering materials, recruiting helpers who presumably don't understand what the boat is for, completing the construction within the specified time frame. He holds a feast, possibly as cover for the unusual project, possibly as final payment to his workers. Then he loads the boat according to the preservation protocol. The loading sequence is detailed. Family members first, preserving the human genetic line through his own descendants. Then the beasts of the field, the animals of the field, breeding pairs or small populations of domestic and wild species. Then craftsmen, people with specialized knowledge of metalworking, pottery, weaving, construction. Then provisions, food, water, supplies needed for survival during and after the catastrophe. The text emphasizes completeness, all that they had brought in, suggesting extensive preparation. The flood, when it comes, is described with meteorological precision that reads almost like a weather report from multiple observation points. The text says, the weapon went against the people like an army. No one could see anyone else. They could not be recognized in the catastrophe. The flood roared like a bull. The wind whinnied like a wild ass. The darkness was dense. The sun was not visible. This is not gentle rain gradually accumulating. This is a storm system of extraordinary violence. Winds strong enough that their sound is compared to animal cries. Darkness so complete that people cannot see each other at arm's length. Flooding so severe it's compared to military assault. The 7-day duration mentioned in other texts becomes more comprehensible if this describes a sustained hurricane or cyclonic superstorm combined with storm surge. Inside the boat, the text describes Atrahasis in darkness, unable to see outside, uncertain whether the boat is surviving the forces battering it. This psychological detail is unusual in ancient texts. The subjective experience of terror during the catastrophe, the isolation of being sealed in darkness while the world outside transforms. On the 7th day, the storm ends. The text says, the sea grew calm, the tempest died down, the flood ceased. Atrahasis opens a window. The first indication the boat design included ventilation that could be sealed during the storm and opened afterward. Light enters. He sees the landscape transformed. The text says, all of mankind had turned to clay, not metaphorically, but literally describing bodies drowned in mud, the population buried in sediment. His response is grief. Atrahasis wept, his tears ran down his face. The preservation was successful, but the cost was total for everyone else. The isolation of the survivor, saved precisely because he followed the procedure, separated from his community precisely because they couldn't be warned, is captured in that image of tears. The boat grounds on a mountain. The text names it Mount Nisir, the same location mentioned in Gilgamesh. Atrahasis releases birds to test conditions. A dove returns, a swallow returns, a raven does not return, indicating land with vegetation exists somewhere within flight range. He exits the boat, performs offerings, and the gods, who have themselves been terrified by the flood they unleashed, described as cowering like dogs during the catastrophe, smell the smoke of his sacrifice and gather. What follows is remarkable. The gods are starving. Without humanity to perform agricultural labour and make offerings, the divine food supply has been cut off. The text describes them crowding around Atrahasis' sacrifice like flies, desperate for the sustenance offerings provide. The hierarchical relationship between gods and humanity, framed earlier as masters and servants, is revealed to be symbiotic. The gods need humanity as much as humanity needs divine guidance. Enlil, arriving at the scene and discovering survivors, is furious. Someone violated the oath. Someone warned humanity. Enki, confronted, doesn't deny his role but argues procedure. He didn't speak directly to Atrahasis, he spoke to a wall. The oath's letter was preserved even as its intent was circumvented. More importantly, Enki argues function, complete destruction of humanity, was a flawed solution because it eliminated the labour force the gods depend on. The divine council is forced to negotiate new terms. Humanity will continue, but measures will be implemented to control population without total destruction. The text describes the establishment of natural limits, infant mortality, women who don't bear children, predators and disease that regulate population organically. These measures are presented not as punishments, but as systemic adjustments, ways to maintain equilibrium between human numbers and divine comfort. Atrahasis and his wife are given life like the gods, the same phrase used for Ziusudra in the Eridu Genesis. They're settled at the mouth of the rivers, possibly the Persian Gulf region, possibly a metaphorical location. The preservation is complete. Humanity continues. The system is rebalanced. The gods return to rest. Agricultural civilization resumes. The Atrahasis epic, as preserved on the Sippar tablets, is not mythology in the sense of explanatory allegory. It's a procedural narrative describing a labour dispute, a flawed solution, an engineer's workaround, successful preservation through technical preparation, and systemic adjustment to prevent future crises. The gods behave like administrators dealing with complex organisational problems. The flood is policy implementation. The preservation is protocol compliance. The resolution is negotiated settlement. What makes this significant is the technical precision. The boat design is specific enough that engineers can evaluate whether it would function. The loading sequence follows logical priority, genes first family, animal, then knowledge, then supplies. The duration is specified. The resolution is systemic, not miraculous. If this text preserves memory of an actual catastrophic flood event, it preserves it in the language of administration and procedure. The survivors were those who received advance warning and followed technical instructions. The knowledge that survived was deliberately selected and preserved. The civilization that resumed was possible because key knowledge carriers were included in the preservation protocol. The tablets themselves exemplify this. BM 78941, BM 78943, and BM 78942 were buried in the ruins of Sippar for nearly 4,000 years. The city was destroyed multiple times, by fire, by conquest, by abandonment, but the tablets, baked hard by fire or by kiln, survived in readable form. When excavated in 1889, cleaned and translated, they transmitted across a 4,000-year gap the story of how knowledge transmission works across catastrophic gaps. The medium preserves the message about preservation. The procedure described is exemplified by the procedure used to describe it. The tablets say, if you want knowledge to survive catastrophe, encode it properly, store it appropriately, ensure it can be recovered later. And the tablets themselves survive, proving the principle. Atrahasis, the exceedingly wise one, is wise precisely because he listens to instructions, follows procedures exactly, preserves what needs preserving, and maintains function through catastrophe. His wisdom is procedural competence. His reward is continuity. His story survives because it was encoded in clay, stored in temple archives, buried by disaster, and excavated by people who could still read the script 4,000 years later. The pattern holds. The procedure works. The preservation succeeds. The text teaches by example. The medium validates the teaching. And we, reading it now, are part of the chain of transmission it describes. The knowledge crossed the gap. The flood was survived. The story continues. Exactly as Atrahasis was told it would, if he followed the procedure. He did. It did. It does. The Anunnaki in assembly. The word Anunnaki appears in Mesopotamian texts spanning 2,000 years of cuneiform literature. It appears in Sumerian texts from the 3rd millennium BC, in Akkadian texts from the 2nd millennium, in Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian texts from the 1st millennium. The name persists, the function persists, but the descriptions vary enough across time and context to make simple definition impossible. Who exactly were the Anunnaki? The name itself offers clues. In Sumerian, it's written Anunnaki or Anunnakine, which scholars pass as those of princely/noble seed or those who from heaven to earth came, depending on how certain signs are read. The Akkadian version, Anunnaki, preserves the name without translation, suggesting it was already established, and its etymology perhaps uncertain even to later scribes. What's consistent across texts is function. The Anunnaki are consistently described as a collective group, not individual deities with separate mythologies. They appear in administrative or judicial contexts. They sit in assembly. They make decisions. They judge. They witness. They maintain order. They are associated with the oldest cities, present from the beginning, and they possess knowledge that predates the current arrangement of civilization. In the Atrahasis epic, the Anunnaki appear as senior gods who hold council to decide matters affecting all deities and humanity. When the Igigi rebel, it's the Anunnaki who convene to hear the complaint and propose solutions. When the flood is decreed, the Anunnaki swear the oath of secrecy. When the flood ends, the Anunnaki gather to reassess policy. They function as governing body, deliberative assembly, court of appeal. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, describes the Anunnaki similarly. After Marduk defeats Tiamat and creates the ordered cosmos, he establishes stations for the gods, assigns duties, and organizes the Anunnaki as judges. Tablet the 6 of the Enuma Elish says, he founded the holy shrine, the dwelling for the Anunnaki. He caused the Anunnaki to sit in the shrine. The emphasis is on establishment of order, assignment of roles, creation of administrative structure. The Anunnaki are not individual heroes with adventure narratives. They are institutional. They represent the organization of divine authority itself, the council through which decisions are made, and order maintained. In the Sumerian composition The Descent of Inanna, the Anunnaki appear as judges of the underworld. When Inanna descends to the realm of the dead, she faces the Anunnaki in their judicial capacity. The text says, the Anunnaki, the judges, seized her. They spoke their verdict, the words that torment the spirit. They function as court, determining fate according to established law. This judicial function appears repeatedly. The Anunnaki judge the dead, witness oaths, enforce cosmic law, maintain the boundaries between proper and improper action. They are associated with me, the Sumerian concept of fundamental organizing principles, the decrees or laws that govern how reality functions. The me are described as being under the care of specific gods, particularly Enki and Inanna, but the Anunnaki collectively oversee their proper implementation. The cylinder seals and boundary stones from various periods show visual representations of divine assemblies where multiple figures sit in formal arrangement, witnessing transactions or judgments. These are often identified by accompanying texts as the Anunnaki in council. The iconography emphasizes multiplicity, formality, and witnessing, not action, but oversight. The question becomes, what kind of beings are described this way? The texts are clear, they're not human, they don't die, they don't age normally, they possess knowledge beyond ordinary human access, they can perform actions humans cannot, but they're also not omnipotent. They argue among themselves, they make mistakes, they need food, though divine food different from human sustenance. They fear consequences, they negotiate. One reading, maintained by mainstream scholarship, is that the Anunnaki are simply the Mesopotamian pantheon, gods in the traditional sense, personifications of natural forces or social functions, mythological beings who exist in stories but not in historical reality. This reading treats all references to the Anunnaki as religious belief, no different from Greek gods or Norse deities, culturally important but factually non-existent. A second reading, common in alternative historical literature, suggests the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial visitors who influenced or created human civilization, and the Sumerian texts preserve memories of this contact encoded in religious language. This reading takes the texts as distorted historical records of actual encounters with technologically advanced beings from elsewhere. A third reading, less commonly explored, suggests the Anunnaki represent a memory of a pre-catastrophe civilization or knowledge system, not gods, not aliens, but an earlier human culture or organization that possessed advanced knowledge and survived long enough to transmit that knowledge across a civilizational collapse. In this reading, the Anunnaki are from heaven in the sense of being from before, from the prior world arrangement, and their knowledge appears divine because it predates the current cycle of civilization. The texts don't decide between these readings. They describe function, not ontology. The Anunnaki teach. They judge. They establish systems. They preserve knowledge across the flood. They appear in assembly. They make collective decisions. They maintain continuity. What's striking is how often the Anunnaki are associated specifically with knowledge transmission and preservation. In Enki and the World Order, Enki distributes the me, the organizing principles, among various deities who will maintain specific domains: agriculture, metalworking, writing, building, weaving. The Anunnaki witness this distribution, ensuring proper assignment and implementation. In the flood narratives, the Anunnaki are present before the catastrophe. They swear oaths about how it will be conducted, and they're present after to witness the preservation and judge the outcome. They span the discontinuity. They provide continuity themselves, institutional memory across the break. In administrative texts from the 3rd millennium BC, oaths are sworn by the Anunnaki, suggesting they function as ultimate witnesses, guarantors of truth, enforcers of agreement. Legal contracts invoke their names. Boundary markers call on them to punish violators. They occupy the role of cosmic notaries, ensuring that agreements hold across time. If the Anunnaki are read as personification of institutional knowledge itself, the accumulated technical and organizational understanding that enables civilization, their portrayal makes functional sense. They are collective, not individual, because institutional knowledge is collective. They are present from the beginning, because knowledge precedes individual applications. They sit in judgment because knowledge provides criteria for evaluation. They survive catastrophes because knowledge, if properly encoded and transmitted, can cross discontinuities that destroy individual lives or single generations. The Sumerian texts consistently describe civilizational knowledge as received, not invented. The arts of civilization, writing, metallurgy, irrigation, astronomy, law, medicine, architecture are gifts from the gods, transmitted through teaching, maintained through institutional memory. The Anunnaki are the institutional form of this knowledge, the collective wisdom that enables complex society. In this reading, kingship descended from heaven means the organizational knowledge of how to run a kingdom was transmitted from those who already possessed it, the Anunnaki, the keepers of pre-flood knowledge, to human populations who would implement it in the post-flood world. The institution descends, humanity receives, civilization resumes. This doesn't require supernatural beings or extraterrestrial intervention. It requires only that knowledge can be preserved through catastrophic discontinuities if encoded properly, and that those who carry such knowledge across the gap appear, to those on the far side, to possess wisdom from another world, which in temporal terms they do. They carry understanding from before, from the prior arrangement, from the world that ended. The flood narratives emphasize this repeatedly. Enki, associated most strongly with the Anunnaki, in his role as wisdom keeper, ensures preservation. He transmits the knowledge needed for survival. He maintains continuity of technical understanding. After the catastrophe, he teaches agriculture, writing, mathematics, governance. He is the bridge across the break. The Anunnaki, in their collective function, are that bridge institutionalized. They are the library that survives the fire, the archive that outlasts the empire, the technical manual that works even when the civilization that wrote it has collapsed. They are knowledge as persistent entity, surviving individual carriers, transmitted across generations, maintaining function despite surface chaos. Whether this knowledge was carried by literal divine beings, by a prior advanced culture, by carefully maintained priesthoods, by written archives, or by some combination, doesn't change the functional description. The texts describe an institutional memory system that preserved pre-catastrophe knowledge and transmitted it forward. They call that system the Anunnaki. The Sumerian king list says kingship descended from heaven. The Eridu Genesis says Enki warned Ziusudra through a wall. Atrahasis says the Anunnaki swore an oath, but one found a workaround. Enki and the world order says the organizing principles were distributed among specialists. All these texts describe the same pattern: knowledge from before, transmitted across the break, implemented after. The Anunnaki are the ones who carry it, the assembly that holds it, the council that maintains it, the judges who apply it, the witnesses who verify it, the teachers who transmit it. They are what survives when everything else doesn't. They are continuity personified. They are institutional memory given name and function. And whether they were gods, humans, or something else matters less than what they did. They preserved. They transmitted. They ensured knowledge crossed the flood. The texts don't explain how. They record that it happened. The mechanism is described procedurally: speaking to walls, building boats, loading seeds, making offerings. The result is documented. Kingship descends again. Cities resume. Civilization continues. The Anunnaki in assembly are the ultimate committee meeting that never ends, the standing session that persists across catastrophes, the institutional form that outlasts any individual institution. They are memory, collective, preserved, transmitted, applied. And 4,000 years later, we read their assembly records in clay, and the knowledge still transmits. The institution still functions. the Anunnaki still teach, exactly as the texts say they do, exactly as they're designed to do. The assembly continues. The knowledge persists. The transmission succeeds. Antarctica's hidden history. On October 24th, 2023, a research team led by Stuart Jameson of Durham University published findings in Nature Communications that revealed something remarkable beneath the East Antarctic ice sheet. Using satellite data and ice-penetrating radar, they had mapped an ancient landscape preserved beneath ice nearly 3 kilometres thick, a network of river valleys, highland ridges, and lowland plains that existed before the ice came, carved by flowing water when Antarctica was temperate. The landscape covers an area roughly the size of Belgium, stretching across the region near the South Pole. The river valleys, now buried and frozen, once drained toward the coast, carrying water from highlands to the sea. The topography shows clear erosion patterns, the signature of running water shaping rock over millions of years. This wasn't a frozen wasteland. This was a functioning watershed, a river system that supported whatever ecosystems existed in pre-ice Antarctica. The dating is crucial. The landscape was formed before the Antarctic ice sheet reached its current configuration, meaning before approximately 34 million years ago. At that time, during the late Eocene epoch, Antarctica was dramatically different. It was still located near the South Pole. Continental drift doesn't move that fast, but the global climate was warm enough that ice sheets were smaller or absent. Forests grew on the continent. Rivers flowed year-round. The annual mean temperature was comparable to present-day Tasmania or New Zealand's South Island. Then something shifted. The transition is called the Eocene-Oligocene boundary, dated to approximately 33.9 million years ago. Within a geologically brief period, a few 100,000 years, global temperatures dropped significantly. Carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere fell from around 1,000 parts per million to below 750 ppm. Ocean circulation patterns changed. The thermal isolation of Antarctica increased, and ice began to accumulate. The ice came from snow that didn't melt. Season after season, year after year, millennium after millennium, snow accumulated on the high interior of Antarctica, compressing under its own weight into glacial ice, flowing outward toward the coasts, building into ice sheets that eventually covered the river valleys, buried the forests, and sealed the entire landscape beneath frozen water up to 4.7 kilometres thick. The process was catastrophically rapid by geological standards, but unimaginably slow by human measures. It took hundreds of thousands of years for the ice to reach its full extent. Anything living on the continent would have had time to migrate northward if capable, or adapt if possible, or be eliminated if neither option succeeded. There was no sudden catastrophe in human terms, no week-long deluge, no single year of freezing, but the result was total transformation. The continent that had sustained flowing water and living ecosystems became the coldest, driest, windiest place on Earth, with 98% of its surface buried under ice. What caused the Eocene-Oligocene transition remains debated. The most widely accepted explanation involves changes in atmospheric carbon dioxide levels, possibly driven by increased weathering of silicate rocks in newly uplifted mountain ranges, which would draw CO from the atmosphere. As greenhouse gas levels dropped, global temperatures declined, polar regions cooled, ice began forming, and a feedback loop initiated. Ice reflects sunlight, reducing warming, allowing more ice to form. Other factors likely contributed. The opening of oceanic gateways as Australia separated from Antarctica allowed circumpolar ocean currents to develop, thermally isolating the continent. Changes in orbital parameters affected the distribution of solar radiation. Volcanic activity may have injected aerosols into the atmosphere, temporarily blocking sunlight. Multiple factors converging within a relatively brief geological window triggered the transition from greenhouse to icehouse Earth. The significance is what that ice preserved. When the rivers stopped flowing, and the ice buried the valleys, it didn't destroy the landscape, it sealed it. The topography carved by millions of years of flowing water remained exactly as it was the moment it froze. The river channels, the valley shapes, the erosion patterns, all preserved in three-dimensional detail beneath the ice, readable now through ice-penetrating radar that can map bedrock topography through thousands of meters of overlying ice. This is a form of archival preservation. The ice acts as both tomb and time capsule. What lies beneath is inaccessible except through extraordinary effort, but it's also unchanged. If organic material exists in those buried valleys, pollen, spores, seeds, wood fragments, anything that was present when the ice came, it would be preserved in the frozen conditions, just as mammoth carcasses are preserved in Siberian permafrost. The subglacial lakes complicate the picture. Lake Vostok, Lake Mercer, and the hundreds of other lakes detected beneath Antarctic ice are not frozen remnants of the pre-ice environment. They're active systems, with liquid water maintained by geothermal heat and pressure from the overlying ice. These lakes formed after the ice sheet developed, carved out by the weight and movement of ice above them, but they contain ancient water. Isotopic analysis of water samples from Lake Vostok suggests the water has been isolated for hundreds of thousands to millions of years. When the drill team retrieved samples from Lake Mercer in 2018, they found organisms, bacteria, and multicellular life that had been sealed away from surface conditions for over 100,000 years. The genetic material recovered included sequences from species that no longer exist on the surface or exist in different forms. These lakes are archives of biological information. DINA is a preservation system, a chemical encoding of instructions for building organisms compressed into molecular form, readable by those with appropriate technology. A bacterium sealed in Lake Mercer preserves in its genome information about conditions when its ancestors were last exposed to surface environments. The genetic code survives across timescales that dwarf written human history. The parallel to the Sumerian tablets becomes clearer. Both are preservation systems. Clay tablets encode information in wedge-shaped impressions that survive fire, burial, and millennia of environmental exposure. Dinar encodes information in chemical sequences that survive freezing, isolation, and millions of years if conditions prevent degradation. Antarctic ice preserves both the physical landscape river valleys, bedrock topography, and the biological informationisms, genetic sequences from before the freeze. If, and this is speculative, not established, if any form of human habitation or activity existed on Antarctic coastlines before the ice reached its full extent, if any coastal settlements or seasonal camps or resource extraction sites existed in accessible regions, those sites would now be beneath hundreds to thousands of meters of ice. They would be as inaccessible as the river valleys mapped by the Durham team. They would be preserved, if they existed, but unreachable without technology that could drill through ice without destroying what's being sought. The geological evidence is clear that Antarctica was not ice-covered for the entire history of the continent. Antarctica separated from South America about 30-35 million years ago, completing the isolation that allowed the circumpolar current to develop. Before that, during the Cretaceous and early Cenozoic, Antarctica was part of the supercontinent Gondwana, connected to South America, Africa, India, and Australia. Fossil evidence confirms forests, dinosaurs, mammals, and diverse ecosystems existed on Antarctica for tens of millions of years before the ice came. But 34 million years ago is far beyond the range of human existence. Anatomically modern humans emerged around 300,000 years ago in Africa. Recorded history extends back roughly 5,000 years. The gap between when Antarctica froze and when humans began writing is a gap of 33,995,000 years. This creates a profound temporal problem for any theory suggesting human knowledge of pre-ice Antarctica. Unless, and again this is speculative, unless the freezing was not complete everywhere simultaneously and pockets of ice-free coastline persisted in geothermally active regions or in areas where ocean currents maintained slightly warmer conditions. Ice core evidence and marine sediment cores show multiple periods over the past several million years when Antarctic ice volume fluctuated significantly, suggesting some regions may have been partially ice-free during warmer interglacial periods. The last glacial maximum, the peak of the most recent ice age about 20,000 years ago, was followed by rapid warming. Sea levels rose over 120 metres as ice sheets melted. Coastlines that were dry land became seafloor, islands became submerged. This process of coastal transformation through climate change is documented globally. Could a similar process have occurred around Antarctica during one of the warmer interglacial periods of the past million years, temporarily exposing coastlines that are now ice-covered again? The evidence is ambiguous. Some researchers studying Antarctic ice cores and marine sediments argue that even during interglacial warming periods, the Antarctic ice sheet remained largely intact, though perhaps reduced in volume. Others point to evidence of ice sheet instability and suggest significant portions of West Antarctica may have been ice-free during the warmest interglacial periods. What's certain is that Antarctica's history is one of radical transformation. A continent that sustained forests and rivers became locked in ice. A temperate environment became the coldest place on Earth. The change was permanent on human timescales. The ice has been there longer than our species has existed. But on geological timescales, it's a recent development. Antarctica was ice-free longer than it's been ice-covered. The ancient river landscape discovered by the Durham team demonstrates what ice preserves. Topography carved by water millions of years ago remains readable through radar mapping. The physics of flowing water, the shapes of erosion, the branching patterns of tributaries, all preserved in frozen stasis beneath the ice, waiting for technology capable of reading through the frozen layers. If Antarctica hides pre-ice evidence of life, forests whose remains lie compressed beneath glacial weight, organisms whose genetic material persists in frozen sediments, ecosystems whose structure can be reconstructed from pollen and spore sequences in ice cores, that evidence is preserved, precisely because ice sealed it away from the degradation processes that destroy most biological remains. And if, in the realm of speculation rather than established science, if some form of human activity ever occurred on Antarctic coasts during brief warm periods, if seasonal camps or exploration or resource gathering occurred on now buried shores, that evidence would also be preserved, sealed. Beneath ice, inaccessible except through drilling that would itself risk destroying fragile remains. The ice is archived. What it contains is preserved. Whether we can read that archive without destroying it is the technical challenge. The Sumerians understood this principle in their own context. Clay tablets buried in temple foundations were archives for future discovery. The medium was chosen because it survived fire and burial. The encoding, cuneiform impressions, remained readable after millennia. The knowledge crossed time because the preservation system functioned. Antarctica is geology's version of the same principle. The ice buries, the ice preserves. The knowledge of what existed before remains encoded in frozen water, in compressed ice layers, in trapped air bubbles, in DNA of buried organisms, in topography of ancient rivers. Both archives exist. Both preserve information from before the flood in Mesopotamia, before the ice in Antarctica. Both require specialized knowledge to read. Both raise the question of what memory survives catastrophic transformation. The answer in both cases, whatever was encoded properly, stored appropriately, and remains accessible to those with tools to read it. The Sumerian tablets can be read. we have the tools: knowledge of cuneiform, understanding of Sumerian and Akkadian languages, archaeological context for interpretation. The Antarctic ice can be read. We have the tools: ice-penetrating radar, drilling technology, genetic sequencing, isotopic analysis, paleoclimate reconstruction. What remains in both archives is there, waiting, preserved, encoded, recoverable. The question is, what we'll find when we drill deep enough. Maps that shouldn't exist. In the Topkapı Palace Museum in Istanbul, preserved in the Palace Library collection, hangs a partial map drawn on gazelle skin parchment. The map is dated to 1513 C and bears the signature of Ottoman admiral and cartographer Piri Reis. The map is famous not for what it shows in the Mediterranean or Atlantic. Those regions are depicted with reasonable accuracy for the period, but for what appears at the bottom edge, a landmass labelled the land discovered by Columbus that extends southward to the edge of the parchment with coastal. Details that shouldn't exist on a 1513 map. The Piri Reis map is one of history's most analysed and debated cartographic documents. What survives is approximately 1/3 of the original map, which would have shown much more when complete. The surviving fragment shows the western coast of Africa, the eastern coast of South America, and portions of the Atlantic Ocean, with various islands and features drawn with varying degrees of accuracy. What makes the map controversial is the southern coastline. The landmass at the bottom of the map shows geographic features, bays, rivers, mountain ranges, depicted as if from aerial view, with detail that early 16th century explorers shouldn't have possessed. Some researchers, examining the map's geometry, have argued that this southern land represents not just South America, but possibly the northern coastline of Antarctica, depicted as it would appear without ice coverage. This claim requires careful examination. Piri Reis himself provided annotations on the map explaining his sources. In notes written in Turkish around the margins, he states that he compiled the map from approximately 20 older maps, including charts captured from Spanish sailors, maps from the time of Alexander the Great, and what he calls the Map of Columbus. He claims these source maps were drawn using mathematical cartography and geometric projection. The critical question is, what were these source maps, and what did they actually depict? Mainstream historians argue that the southern landmass on the Piri Reis map is simply South America, distorted through the process of copying from multiple source maps with different projections and scales, resulting in geographic errors that coincidentally resemble features that don't actually exist. The mountains depicted might be the Andes, misplaced. The rivers might be the Amazon and barren systems, distorted through cartographic telephone game, but some features resist easy explanation. Charles Hapgood, a professor of history of science, analysed the Piri Reis map in the 1960s and argued that the mathematics of the map's projection suggested knowledge of longitude calculation that shouldn't have existed in 1513. He further argued that certain coastal features in the southern section, when matched against modern mapping of the Antarctic coastline beneath the ice, showed suspicious similarities, bays and peninsulas, in approximately correct positions and proportions. Hapgood's work has been criticised on methodological grounds. Cartographic historians point out that selective matching of features on poorly scaled ancient maps to modern coastlines can produce apparent correlations that aren't statistically significant. If you compare enough distorted lines to enough actual coastlines, you'll find matches by chance. The human tendency to find patterns, pareidolia applied to cartography, can make ambiguous features seem specific when we're looking for particular correlations. Moreover, Antarctica wasn't officially sighted until 1820, and the continent wasn't fully mapped until the 20th century. Modern mapping of the bedrock topography beneath Antarctic ice, what the coastline would look like if the ice melted, wasn't possible until satellite radar mapping in the late 20th century. For the Peary Race map to show Antarctica's ice-free coastline would require that his source maps dated to before the ice covered the continent, which would place them millions of years before human civilization existed. This is the temporal impossibility that makes the Antarctica interpretation untenable for mainstream historians. But the map remains puzzling. Peary Race claimed to be working from ancient sources. He specifically stated he was compiling from older maps that had been passed down through generations of sailors and cartographers. If those source maps contained errors, distortions, or purely imaginative geography for regions that hadn't been explored, then copying them faithfully would reproduce those errors on the 1513 map. But what if the source maps contained information from an earlier period of exploration that was subsequently lost? Not from millions of years ago, that remains impossible, but from earlier civilizations that engaged in more extensive maritime exploration than surviving records indicate. There is precedent for knowledge loss. The Library of Alexandria contained countless texts that were subsequently destroyed. Medieval libraries held Greek and Roman scientific works that were lost during the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, only to be rediscovered centuries later through Arabic translations. The navigational knowledge of Polynesian wayfinders allowed them to colonize Pacific islands across thousands of kilometers of open ocean using techniques that weren't written down and nearly vanished as oral traditions were disrupted by colonial contact. If ancient maritime cultures, Phoenician, Carthaginian, Polynesian, or civilizations we don't have records of, conducted extensive exploration and cartographic surveys, and if that information was preserved in maps passed down through trading networks, then fragments of that knowledge could survive in later compilations even after the original context was lost. The Peary Race map might be copying geographic information from such earlier sources without understanding what regions were being depicted. A coastline labelled as discovered by Columbus might actually be compiled from multiple sources, some showing South America accurately, others showing imagined or misidentified lands, still others perhaps preserving fragments of earlier exploration data that was being faithfully copied even, though its meaning was no longer understood. This interpretation doesn't require Antarctica. It requires only that some of Peary Race's source maps contained information he didn't have context for, which he copied accurately because cartographers are trained to reproduce source material faithfully even when they don't fully understand it. But the controversy persists because the map does show features that seem too specific to be purely random error. The coastal indentations, the river systems, the proportions, they're not perfectly accurate, but they're not completely random either. Something is being depicted, drawn from some source, representing some geographic information that the map maker believed was worth preserving. Other anomalous maps exist in historical collections. The Orontius Phineas map of 1531 shows a southern continent labelled Terra Australis, with mountain ranges and rivers depicted in the interior, decades before any European exploration of Antarctica. The map shows a continent roughly in the correct position for Antarctica, though with significant distortions in shape and scale. The Boische map of 1737, created by French cartographer Philippe Boische, shows Antarctica as two separate landmasses divided by a channel or strait, which is actually roughly accurate to the bedrock topography beneath the ice, where West Antarctica is separated from East Antarctica by a subglacial channel that would become a strait if the ice melted. Boische explicitly stated he was basing his map on older source materials, though he didn't specify what those sources were. Are these maps evidence of ancient knowledge of Antarctica? The mainstream answer is no. They're evidence of cartographic tradition and convention. Ancient geographers theorized that a large southern landmass must exist to balance the known landmasses of the Northern Hemisphere, a concept called Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. Medieval and Renaissance mapmakers drew this theoretical continent on maps, despite having no actual exploration data, essentially making educated guesses about what must exist based on geographic theory. As actual exploration occurred, the imaginary southern continent was adjusted to fit new discoveries. Australia was initially thought to be part of Terra Australis. When circumnavigation proved Australia was separate, the theoretical southern continent was pushed further south. When Antarctica was finally discovered in the 1820s, it turned out there actually was a southern continent roughly where theory predicted it should be, though smaller and more ice-covered than imagined. So the presence of southern continents on pre-discovery maps doesn't prove ancient knowledge. It proves geographic theorizing and the tendency of mapmakers to fill in blank spaces with plausible but unverified landmasses. But this explanation doesn't fully account for the specificity of some features. If the Gouache map's depiction of Antarctica as two landmasses is based purely on theory, why would the cartographer theorize a divided continent? The aesthetic or theoretical reasoning isn't obvious. If it's based on older source maps, what did those sources show, and why would they depict a divided land? The mystery remains unresolved because the source chain is broken. Peary Race's original compilation sources are lost. We have only his 1513 copy and his annotations about what he used. Gouache's source materials are similarly lost to history. We're left with final products separated by centuries from their ultimate origins, trying to reconstruct what the original cartographers knew and how they knew it. This is exactly the situation with the Sumerian texts. The tablets we have are copies, often copies, of earlier source materials. The Weld Blundell prism was inscribed in 1800 BC, but it records kings allegedly ruling in 30,000 BCE. The original source of that information is lost. The Eridu Genesis tablet from Nippur is a copy from the Old Babylonian period, but it preserves traditions the Sumerians themselves considered ancient. Where did that information originate? How many transmission steps separate the events described from the clay tablets we can read? Both the anomalous maps and the Sumerian king lists present the same epistemological problem. They claim to preserve information from much earlier than the surviving documents themselves. They both describe this information as compiled from older sources. They both show signs of corruption or distortion through transmission, and they both contain elements that seem more specific than pure invention would produce, yet more problematic than straightforward historical record would allow. The most cautious interpretation is that both are mixtures, some accurate information, some error, some imagination, some misunderstood fragments of earlier knowledge, all compiled together by later editors who were trying to be faithful to their sources but didn't have full context for what those sources meant. The Peary Race map is real. It hangs in Istanbul, drawn on gazelle skin, dated 1513. It shows something in its southern section, whether that something is misdrawn South America, theoretical Terra Australis, fragments of earlier exploration data, or something else, entirely depends on assumptions about what's possible and what kind of evidence is required to overturn those assumptions. The Sumerian tablets are real. They sit in museums in Oxford, London and Philadelphia, impressed into clay, dated to the 2nd millennium BC. They describe antediluvian kings, floods, preservation procedures and knowledge from before. Whether that information is mythology, distorted history, symbolic chronology, or preserved memory of actual pre-catastrophe systems depends on similar assumptions about what's possible and what kind of evidence counts. Neither the maps nor the tablets prove ancient advanced civilizations knew of Antarctica. but both suggest that knowledge transmission across long time periods through multiple copying stages produces documents that are difficult to interpret, that preserve fragments we can't fully explain, and that resist both simple dismissal and uncritical acceptance. The maps exist, the tablets exist. What they ultimately mean remains in that uncomfortable space between obviously false and definitively proven, the space where mystery persists because the evidence is real but incomplete, specific but ambiguous, suggestive but not conclusive. Perhaps that's the appropriate conclusion. Some mysteries remain mysterious, not because evidence is absent, but because the evidence that exists doesn't fit cleanly into any single interpretive framework. The maps hint, the tablets record. Both suggest that knowledge moves through time in ways more complex than straightforward transmission or pure invention. And both remind us that what we don't know often includes things we can see but cannot yet properly interpret. The Piri Reis map hangs in Istanbul. You can visit, you can examine it, you can read Piri Reis's annotations about his sources, and you can stand before it wondering what exactly those source maps showed and why he thought it worth preserving. The question persists across centuries. The map remains. The mystery continues. The Barton cylinder, creation before memory. In 1889, during excavations at the ancient Sumerian city of Nippur, archaeologists from the University of Pennsylvania discovered a clay cylinder approximately 10 centimetres long and 5 centimetres in diameter. The cylinder was covered entirely in minute cuneiform inscription, 16 columns of text wrapped around its surface in the archaic Sumerian script used during the early dynastic period around 2400 BCE. The cylinder was eventually catalogued as CBS 8383 and became known as the Barton cylinder, named after George Barton, the scholar who published its first complete translation in the early 20th century. The text it contains is remarkable for its age and its content. It's one of the oldest written creation accounts in human history, predating the biblical Genesis by approximately 800 years, predating even the Babylonian Atrahasis by several centuries. What makes the Barton cylinder particularly significant is not just its age, but the way it describes creation. The text doesn't present creation as divine command spoken into void, nor as cosmic battle between order and chaos. Instead, it describes a process of establishment and organisation, as if creation is less about making something from nothing and more about arranging and systematising what already exists in unstructured form. The text is damaged and difficult to read in places, 2,400 years of burial compressed and eroded portions of the soft clay, but enough survives to reconstruct the general narrative. It begins with establishing the city of Nippur and continues through a sequence describing the establishment of various elements of the cosmic order. The opening section, in the translation provided by the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature with later scholarly amendments, reads, Enlil, to bring forth what is useful, to make the fields fertile, laid out the settlements. Enlil, when he gave his pronouncement, caused trees and reeds. To grow, he constructed cities, he founded settlements. The structure is procedural. Enlil, the senior deity, doesn't create by fiat, but by construction and establishment. Cities are founded, settlements are laid out, fields are made fertile. This is engineering language, not mystical emanation. The verb forms are those used for building, planting, organising. The text continues with what scholars interpret as a creation of humanity, though the preserved text is fragmentary here. References to black-headed people, the Sumerian term for humans, referring to hair colour, suggest the establishment of human populations within the organised cosmic system. As with other Sumerian creation accounts, humans appear not as the pinnacle of creation, but as functional components in an already existing system. What's most striking is the text's treatment of this creative process as re-establishment. Several passages use language suggesting that what's being described is not the absolute beginning of everything, but the restoration or establishment of order after some prior disruption. The text speaks of making firm the foundations and causing the brick to be laid, metaphors that suggest rebuilding or establishing on an existing foundation. This pattern, creation as restoration, appears throughout Sumerian cosmological texts. The Eridu Genesis describes cities being established when kingship descended from heaven, implying systems were transferred rather than invented from scratch. The Atrahasis begins with gods already existing and engaged in labour, then creates humans to take over that labour, not creating a universe but solving a workforce problem within an already functioning system. The Barton cylinder fits this pattern. It describes Enlil establishing order, founding cities, making the land productive. The implication is that Enlil is working with materials and landscapes that already exist, organising them into functional civilization rather than creating matter itself from void. This conceptual framework, creation as organisation rather than as origination, is consistent with how the Sumerians seem to have understood civilization generally. They didn't claim to have invented agriculture, metallurgy, writing, or urban planning through gradual human innovation. They claimed these arts were taught by the gods, or were already established when kingship descended from heaven. Their understanding of their own civilization was that it represented the implementation of knowledge that existed before, not the original development of knowledge from zero. The Barton cylinder, inscribed around 2400 BCE, is itself evidence of this principle. Writing existed at that point. The cuneiform script was already developed enough to record complex grammatical structures and abstract concepts. The cylinder itself is a product of technological sophistication, the ability to form clay uniformly, inscribe text with precision, fire it to permanent hardness, and store it in temple archives as part of an institutional record-keeping system. None of this emerged instantly. Writing developed over several centuries from simpler accounting tokens and pictographs. Pottery and clayworking were millennia-old crafts by the time the Barton cylinder was inscribed. Temple institutions were products of generations of organisational development. But the text inscribed on this cylinder describes the establishment of civilization as if it happened through divine instruction and systematization, not through gradual human innovation. This disconnect between the archaeological evidence of gradual development and the textual claims of sudden establishment through divine teaching has troubled scholars since Sumerian texts were first translated. How do we reconcile texts that claim civilization was taught by gods with archaeological evidence showing gradual development of technologies over long periods? One approach is to dismiss the texts as mythology, symbolic stories meant to convey religious meaning, not historical information. In this reading, the Barton cylinder preserves religious belief about divine origins, but tells us nothing about actual history. A second approach is to recognise that the text might preserve memory of rapid cultural transmission at certain key points, even if the technologies themselves developed gradually. If knowledge of agriculture, for example, spread rapidly through Mesopotamia when it was introduced from another region, the Levant or Anatole, where it had already been developed, the recipients of that knowledge would experience it as sudden arrival of a complete system taught by foreigners who possessed it already. Over generations, the memory of that transmission might be encoded in stories of gods teaching humans agriculture. A third approach, less common in mainstream scholarship, is to consider whether the text might preserve memory of an earlier, more advanced phase of civilization that was disrupted, with the establishment described in texts like the Barton cylinder actually referring to re-establishment after collapse. In this reading, the Sumerian civilization we can excavate archaeologically might be a recovery phase, and the texts preserve memory of an earlier peak whose material remains are either unexcavated or was so thoroughly destroyed that they're not recognisable in the archaeological record. This third approach requires explaining where this earlier civilization was, why there's no clear material evidence for it, and what kind of catastrophe could destroy it thoroughly enough to require complete re-establishment while somehow preserving the knowledge in transmissible form. These are not trivial problems, and most scholars find the explanation more complex than the evidence requires. But the texts persist in their claims. Creation is establishment, civilization is taught, knowledge descends from those who already possess it. The foundational framework is already there, the work is organising it into functional form. The Barton cylinder as a physical object embodies this principle. It's a clay artefact hardened by fire, inscribed with knowledge, stored in a temple archive, surviving 4,400 years of war, weather, abandonment and burial, then excavated and translated, transmitting across that vast gap the same message it transmitted when first inscribed civilization was. Established through the application of knowledge that existed before. The cylinder doesn't explain where that prior knowledge came from. It doesn't detail the mechanisms of transmission. It records the outcome, Enlil, established, organised, made fertile, founded settlements. The prior state was undefined. The post-establishment state is the ordered world the Sumerians inhabited. Whether this represents religious belief, distorted history, or preserved memory of actual events beyond the archaeological horizon, the conceptual framework is consistent across Sumerian literature. Civilization is not invented, it's implemented. Knowledge is not discovered, it's transmitted. The current arrangement is not the first, it's a restoration. The Barton cylinder sits in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, catalogue number CBS 8383, a small clay object covered in tiny impressed signs, one of the oldest written creation accounts in existence. It was old when the pyramids were new, it was ancient when the biblical Genesis was being compiled, it predates classical Greek philosophy by 2 millennia, and it says, in its archaic Sumerian syntax, that what we call creation is actually organisation, that civilization is establishment according to prior pattern. That knowledge descends from those who possess it to those who will maintain it. The cylinder itself descended through time, buried in Nippur's ruins, waiting 4,000 years to be excavated by people who could read its script and wrestle with its implications. It survives. Its message survives. The pattern it describes, knowledge transmitted across catastrophic gaps through appropriate preservation systems, is exemplified by its own existence. We read it now. The transmission continues. The knowledge descends through time exactly as the text says it does. The cylinder was inscribed before memory. It survives into our present. It will exist after we're gone, if preserved properly, transmitting the same message to whoever next excavates or studies it. Civilization is established. Knowledge descends. Order is imposed on chaos through understanding. The pattern holds. The medium functions. The message crosses time. The Barton cylinder is evidence. Of what exactly remains the question we each answer according to the framework we bring to the evidence. But the evidence exists. Small, clay, covered in tiny impressions, containing one of humanity's earliest preserved attempts to explain where order came from. It says order was established by those who knew how, before our memory begins. And the cylinder itself, hardened clay, preserved text, transmitted knowledge, proves that such establishment is possible, because here it is, still readable, still teaching, still establishing order in minds that encounter it 4,400 years after the scribe pressed the stylus into wet clay and set it aside to dry. The creation it describes might be uncertain. The creation it represents, preserved knowledge crossing time, is demonstrated fact. Knowledge inherited, not invented. The Sumerian language has specific grammatical structures for describing how knowledge is acquired. The verb stem pad means to find or to discover. The verb stem zu means to know, and the verb stem namtar means to decree or to fix as destiny. When Sumerian texts describe the origins of civilizational knowledge, agriculture, writing, metallurgy, law, they consistently avoid pad. They don't describe these things as discovered or found. Instead, they use structures indicating teaching, receiving, and decreeing. This linguistic pattern is not accidental. Sumerian scribes were trained for years in precise grammatical usage. The choice of verb forms was deliberate and meaningful. When texts describe how humanity acquired the arts of civilization, the grammar itself encodes a claim. This knowledge was not invented by humans through discovery, it was transmitted to humans through teaching. The text Enki and the World Order, preserved in multiple manuscript copies from the Old Babylonian period, provides one of the clearest examples. The composition describes Enki travelling to various regions and cities, establishing systems and assigning responsibilities. The text uses formulaic repetition, with each section following the same pattern. Enki approaches a location, he evaluates its current state, he fixes its destiny, numtar, establishing what that place will be for. He assigns a deity to oversee the proper functioning of that domain. He moves to the next location. For Sumer itself, the text says, he directed the plough and the yoke, he opened the holy furrows, he made grain grow in the cultivated fields, the lord of the cultivation with the measuring rod in his hand, Enki, established fields for them, the grain god, he appointed as field constable. Notice the verb structures. Enki directed, opened, established, appointed. These are transitive verbs acting on objects that already exist conceptually. The plough exists as an idea, Enki directs it. The furrows exist as a possibility, Enki opens them. Fields exist as potential, Enki establishes them for humanity's use. The knowledge of agriculture is assigned to a specialist deity who will oversee its implementation. The text doesn't say humans watch plants grow and gradually figured out cultivation. It says cultivation was established for them, assigned to them, with a divine overseer appointed to maintain the system. The knowledge comes from outside the human population, descends to them, and is maintained by institutional structure. For metallurgy, the text describes Enki approaching the land of Meluhar and addressing various craft specializations. He directed the smelting furnace, he installed the fire-quenching water, the smith, the jeweller, the silver worker, the leather worker, the fuller, all these, as lords, as princes, was established by Enki's hand. The crafts are not described as invented, they are directed, installed, established. The specialists, smith, jeweller, worker, are placed in their roles as lords and as princes, suggesting these positions carry authority and specialized knowledge that elevates their status. They're not learning through trial and error. They're being installed in roles for which the knowledge already exists. Writing receives similar treatment in other texts. The invention of cuneiform is attributed to the god Nisaba, or in some texts to Enki directly. The me, the fundamental organizing principles, include specific me for the scribe art, the tablet writing, the reed pen. These are treated as discrete transferable packages of knowledge, existing before any human uses them, assigned to humanity through divine teaching. The Sumerian king list reinforces this pattern. After stating kingship descended from heaven, it proceeds to list kings who ruled according to that descended system. The institution of kingship, the organizational structure of royal authority, is not described as emerging from tribal leadership or developing through political evolution. It descends, complete, as a system. In the Akkadian text, the Babylonian Theodicy, a wisdom dialogue from the late 2nd millennium BC, a sufferer questions divine justice and at one point states, "Those who do not seek the god go the way of prosperity, while those who pray to the goddess have become destitute and impoverished." The respondent in the dialogue eventually argues that humans cannot understand divine wisdom because the mind of the god, like the centre of the heavens, is remote. His knowledge is difficult. People cannot understand it. This passage doesn't dispute that gods possess knowledge. It affirms it. The issue is that divine knowledge is remote, difficult, not fully accessible to human understanding. The framework assumes gods have superior knowledge. The question is only how much humans can access through proper devotion and procedure. This consistent pattern, knowledge possessed by gods, transmitted to humans, maintained through proper procedure, appears so regularly in Mesopotamian literature that it constitutes a core assumption of their worldview. They didn't conceptualize themselves as the originators of their own civilization. They conceptualized themselves as recipients and maintainers of systems taught to them. Archaeological evidence shows clear gradual development of technologies. Pottery develops through stages, from simple hand-formed vessels to sophisticated wheel-thrown forms with complex glazes. Metallurgy progresses from native copperworking to alloying bronze to smelting iron. Writing evolves from accounting tokens to pictographs to the full cuneiform system over several centuries. This gradual development is materially demonstrable through stratified excavation. But the texts don't describe it that way. The texts describe rapid establishment through teaching. How do we reconcile material gradualism with textual claims of sudden transmission? One possibility, the texts preserve memory of key transmission moments rather than the full developmental arc. If agricultural knowledge spread into Mesopotamia from the Levantine corridor, where it had already been developed over millennia, the Mesopotamian recipients would experience it as complete system taught by foreigners. The foreigners would seem to possess godlike knowledge of how to control plant growth. Over generations, this memory of transmission might be encoded as gods taught us agriculture. Similarly, if writing was developed in one centre, possibly Uruki, and then spread to other Sumerian cities, the recipient cities would experience writing as a complete system taught by specialists from the originating centre. Those specialists would possess knowledge that elevated their status. They were keepers of a transformative technology. Over time, memory of this spread might be encoded as Nisaba gave us writing or Enki established the scribe art. This explanation preserves the core accuracy of the transmission memory. Knowledge did come from outside, was taught by those who possessed it, and was maintained by specialist institutions, while recognizing that the ultimate origin of the knowledge was still human development, just happening elsewhere or earlier than the text's immediate scope. But some aspects resist this explanation. The Sumerian king list doesn't just claim knowledge was transmitted, it claims the transmission occurred after the flood, and the pre-flood period involved a different arrangement with impossibly long rains. This suggests the texts are making claims about transmission across a major discontinuity, not just diffusion from one contemporary region to another. The flood narratives themselves emphasize preservation across catastrophe. Ziusudra, Atrahasis, Utnapishtim, the flood survivors in various textual traditions, are all described as preserving not just biological life but knowledge bearers. Craftsmen are specifically included in the cargo. Seed stock is preserved. The implication is that specialized knowledge must survive the catastrophe or it will be lost entirely. This emphasis on preservation through discontinuity suggests the texts are encoding memory of knowledge that needed to be actively maintained through some disruptive event. Not gradual diffusion, but emergency preservation and subsequent re-implementation. If there was a major flooding event or series of events in the Mesopotamian river valleys severe enough to disrupt settlement patterns, destroy cities, and create a cultural memory of catastrophic inundation, then the preservation and retransmission of specialized knowledge after that event would be a real historical problem with real solutions. Imagine a scenario. Catastrophic flooding destroys multiple urban centres. Populations scatter to higher ground. When the waters recede, survivors return to find cities buried in silt, irrigation systems destroyed, administrative archives, water damaged or lost. The survivors include some craftsmen, some priests who remember temple procedures, some farmers who retained seed stocks, some scribes who can still read and write. These specialists become the nucleus for rebuilding. Their knowledge, which they preserve through the catastrophe, enables the restoration of civilization. To those being taught by these survivors, the specialists would seem to possess knowledge from before, from the prior world arrangement that was destroyed. They would be teachers of inherited knowledge, not inventors. They would establish systems according to patterns they remember, not discover new systems through experimentation. They would be transmitters, maintaining continuity across the catastrophic break. Over generations, as the material destruction fades from living memory, but the institutional memory persists in temple archives and ritual recitation, the story would transform. The specialists become gods, or God-taught heroes. The catastrophe becomes the flood. The preserved knowledge becomes divine teaching. But the core pattern remains accurate. Knowledge was inherited from before, transmitted by those who possessed it, received by populations who maintained it according to instruction. The Sumerian texts, read this way, are institutional memory of knowledge transmission across discontinuity. They accurately preserve the pattern, transmission, not invention, even if the specific details have been transformed through centuries of retelling. This interpretation doesn't require believing gods literally taught humans agriculture. It requires recognizing that the texts are encoding a real pattern in mythological language. Civilizational knowledge was inherited from earlier sources, transmitted through teaching, and maintained through institutional procedure. The sources might have been earlier human cultures, earlier phases of the same culture, or specialists who preserved knowledge through catastrophes. But the relationship the texts describe, received knowledge, not discovered knowledge, remains accurate to the underlying historical process. The alternative reading, that the texts are purely symbolic mythology with no historical kernel, requires explaining why the Sumerians would invent a story making themselves seem passive recipients rather than heroic inventors. Cultures typically aggrandize their own achievements. The Roman foundation myths credit Romulus and Remus with divine parentage, but make them active founders. Greek myths credit human heroes, Prometheus, Theseus, Heracles, with bringing gifts to humanity through clever theft or brave deeds. But the Sumerian texts don't credit humans with inventing civilization. They credit humans with maintaining civilization that was taught to them. This is an unusual mythological choice, unless it reflects an actual cultural self-understanding based on some historical experience of receiving rather than originating. The linguistic evidence supports this. The consistent use of teaching, transmitting grammatical structures, rather than discovering, inventing structures, suggests this wasn't just poetic choice, but encoded worldview. The Sumerians understood themselves as inheritors and maintainers. Their civilizational identity was built on the idea that they had received something precious from before, and their responsibility was to preserve it. This explains the obsessive documentation, the king lists, the administrative texts, the temple archives, the careful copying of older tablets, even when the language was becoming archaic. All this effort makes sense if the culture understood its primary function as preservation and transmission of inherited knowledge. If you believe you invented everything yourself, you might be less careful about documentation. If you believe you're maintaining a system taught to you that must be passed forward, documentation becomes sacred duty. The Sumerian scribal schools trained students by having them copy ancient texts repeatedly. Apprentice scribes spent years copying the same traditional compositions, literary works, mathematical tables, lexical lists. This pedagogy emphasized exact replication rather than creative innovation. The goal was to maintain the tradition with perfect fidelity. This makes sense in a culture that understood knowledge as inherited. If the knowledge comes from before, from an authoritative source that must be preserved accurately, then exact copying is the highest scribal virtue. Innovation would be corruption. Creativity would be error. The goal is faithful transmission across time. The tablets themselves embody this principle. CBS 17673, the Eridu Genesis tablet, is a copy. BM 78941, the Atrahasis tablet, is a copy. The Weld Blundell prism is a compilation of earlier sources. Even the Barton cylinder, inscribed in 2400 BC, likely preserves traditions older than its physical inscription date. We don't have originals. We have copies of copies, created by scribes, whose function was to transmit knowledge from earlier sources to later recipients. The entire cuneiform corpus is a transmission system. Clay tablets, impressed with standardized signs, dried or fired, stored in archives, copied when damaged, recopied when language changed, maintained across centuries by institutional dedication to preservation. The system worked. We can read 4,000-year-old texts because the preservation procedures were effective. And what those texts claim consistently is that this pattern, knowledge inherited, transmitted through teaching, maintained through procedure, is not just how texts work, but how civilization itself works. Knowledge descends, specialists teach, institutions maintain, recipients preserve and pass forward. The texts don't describe the ultimate origin of knowledge. They describe its movement through time, from before to now, from those who possessed it to those who would maintain it, from gods or ancestors or pre-flood sources to post-flood populations rebuilding civilization. The pattern is transmission. The medium is teaching. The result is inherited knowledge, not invented knowledge. And the texts themselves, transmitted across 4,000 years, taught by specialists who can read dead languages, maintained in institutions dedicated to preservation, demonstrate that such transmission is not mythological but actual. We inherited these texts. We didn't invent them. We're reading knowledge transmitted across catastrophic discontinuities of language death, civilizational collapse, and cultural transformation. The tablets survived. The knowledge crossed time. The transmission succeeded, exactly as the tablets say it does, exactly as their existence proves it can. The pattern holds. Knowledge is inherited. Transmission is possible. Maintenance requires proper procedure. The Sumerians knew this. They encoded it in grammar. They demonstrated it through practice. They transmitted it to us. And we, reading their tablets now, are proof the system works. Subglacial archives, natural and artificial. In August 2008, on the Norwegian island of Spitsbergen deep in the Arctic Circle, engineers completed construction of a facility designed to survive the end of the world. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault, carved into the side of a sandstone mountain 120 metres above sea level, consists of 3 storage chambers maintained at -18 degrees Celsius, protected by airlocks and blast-proof doors, secured in permafrost that would keep the facility frozen even if mechanical cooling failed. The purpose of the seed vault is preservation through catastrophe. The facility stores duplicate samples of seeds from gene banks worldwide, over 1 million seed varieties as of 2024, representing humanity's agricultural biodiversity. If disease, war, climate change or any other catastrophe destroys regional seed stocks, the Svalbard Vault preserves backup copies that can be withdrawn to restore lost varieties. The design philosophy is instructive. The vault is placed in a geologically stable region far from tectonic activity. The elevation protects against sea level rise. The permafrost provides natural cooling that functions even without power. The location in Norwegian territory offers political stability and treaty protection. Multiple redundant security systems protect against unauthorized access. The facility is designed to require minimal human intervention. Seeds can remain viable for centuries or millennia if temperature is maintained. And the permafrost ensures temperature stability even in worst-case scenarios. This is artificial preservation, designed to mimic natural preservation. The engineers studied how nature preserves biological information across deep time and intentionally replicated those conditions. Cold, stable, dark, protected from environmental variation, sealed from contamination, designed to survive the failure of the civilization that built it. The Antarctic ice sheet functions according to the same principles, but at geological scale. Ice accumulates, compressing air bubbles that preserve atmospheric samples. Snow layers record temperature and precipitation patterns. Volcanic ash layers mark eruption events. Cosmic dust captures supernova signatures. Pollen and spores embedded in ice preserve genetic information from ancient ecosystems. The ice is a multi-format archive, recording climate history in chemical, isotopic, and biological detail across 800,000 years in cores like those drilled at Dome C. But ice preserves more than atmospheric data. Lake Vostok and the other subglacial lakes preserve liquid water and living organisms sealed away from surface conditions for hundreds of thousands to millions of years. The organisms found in Lake Mercer samples include bacteria and multicellular life that have been genetically isolated from surface populations for over 100,000 years. Their genomes are archives of biological information from pre-isolation periods, readable through genetic sequencing. Dinar is perhaps the most sophisticated preservation system in nature. The double helix structure protects information through redundancy. Each strand contains the full code, so partial damage can be error-corrected using the intact strand. The chemical stability of the base pairs allows information to persist for thousands of years in favourable conditions. Dinar extracted from Neanderthal bones, 40,000 years old, has been successfully sequenced. Dinar from permafrost-preserved mammoths has been analysed. Even dinar from Egyptian mummies, 3,000 years old, remains partially readable despite mummification chemistry that should degrade nucleic acids. In frozen conditions, dinar preservation improves dramatically. The cold slows chemical degradation. The isolation prevents contamination. If frozen rapidly and kept continuously frozen, dinar can remain viable across timescales relevant to glacial cycles. The organisms in Lake Mercer, sealed beneath ice for 100,000 years, preserve in their dinar information about conditions when their ancestors last encountered surface environments. This is passive biological archiving. The organisms aren't trying to preserve information for future discovery. They're simply existing, and their existence preserves encoded information as a side effect. Their genomes contain instructions for building organisms adapted to particular environmental conditions. If those conditions change, if they're sealed beneath ice, the genetic information becomes a record of prior states. Cuneiform tablets function similarly, but through intentional design. Clay is an abundant, easily worked material. Impressing signs with a reed stylus requires minimal technology. Drying hardens the clay enough for handling and storage. Firing, whether intentional in kilns or accidental in city fires, makes the tablets nearly indestructible. Buried in dry conditions, clay tablets can survive indefinitely. Even water damage, which softens unfired tablets, can often be reversed through careful conservation techniques. The chemical composition of clay makes it particularly stable. Clay minerals are hydrated aluminum silicates, filler silicates with layered crystal structures. Once dried, the crystal structure locks in place. Firing drives off remaining water and fuses the particles, creating a ceramic material resistant to biological decay, chemical weathering, and mechanical stress within the range of burial conditions. The Mesopotamian climate inadvertently optimized preservation. The region is dry, reducing water damage. Temperature extremes are limited compared to regions with freeze-thaw cycles that fracture ceramics. The alluvial soil is fine-grained and stable, providing consistent burial conditions. The cultural practice of burying archives in foundation deposits meant tablets were often placed in locations that would be protected even if buildings above were destroyed. The destruction itself became preservation. When cities burned, through warfare, accident, or deliberate demolition, the fires baked unfired tablets, hardening them to ceramic permanence. Tablets that would have eventually eroded if left sun-dried became as durable as pottery. The catastrophe that destroyed the civilization improved the survival chances of its written records. This is preservation through transformation, similar to how coal forms from forests or fossils form from organisms. The original material undergoes chemical change that stabilizes it against further degradation. The information encoded in the original form persists through the transformation into a more durable medium. Archaeological conservation of cuneiform tablets follows procedures that mirror this understanding. When tablets are excavated, they're often still damp from groundwater or contaminated with salts. Conservation requires careful drying, salt removal, and sometimes controlled refiring to stabilize the clay. The process reverses some damage while preserving the information encoded in the impressed signs. Modern digital preservation faces similar challenges. How do you store information across timescales that exceed the functional life of storage media? Magnetic tape degrades. Hard drives fail. Optical discs delaminate. Cloud storage depends on continuous power and institutional maintenance. Digital formats become obsolete. 8-inch floppies, zip drives, CD-ROMs all become unreadable when hardware disappears. The solution proposed by long-term digital preservation initiatives is format migration and redundancy. Copy data to new media before old media fails. Maintain multiple copies in geographically distributed locations. Use standardized formats that can be decoded even if original software is lost. Build institutions committed to ongoing maintenance. This is essentially replicating what the Mesopotamian scribal institutions did. They copied old tablets before they deteriorated. They maintained archives in multiple cities. They used standardized cuneiform that remained readable even as spoken languages changed. They built temples committed to maintaining these archives as religious duty. The Sumerian archival system worked. We can read 4,000-year-old tablets because the preservation procedures were effective. The medium, clay, was appropriate. The encoding, cuneiform, was standardized. The institutional commitment, temple archives, persisted across political changes. The physical protection, burial in foundations, survived city destructions. Compare this to Antarctic ice core preservation. The medium, ice, naturally maintains stable conditions. The encoding, chemical and isotopic signatures, follows physical laws that remain constant. The institutional commitment, International Antarctic Treaty Research Cooperation, has persisted since 1961. The physical protection, remoteness, extreme climate, deters interference. Both systems demonstrate that long-term preservation requires appropriate medium, standardized encoding, institutional maintenance, and physical security. Both show that information can cross catastrophic discontinuities if the preservation system is designed correctly. The seed vault on Svalbard is humanity's conscious attempt to replicate these principles. We've identified what needs preserving, genetic diversity of crops. We've chosen an appropriate medium, seeds, which naturally preserve genetic information in dormant state. We've standardized the encoding, seed storage protocols used worldwide. We've built institutional commitment, international cooperation under Norwegian jurisdiction. We've provided physical protection, Arctic location, mountain enclosure, multiple redundant security systems. The vault is designed to survive scenarios where human civilization might not: nuclear war, climate catastrophe, pandemic, asteroid impact. If such events occur, the vault should persist, and future populations, whether survivors from the original civilization or new populations emerging later, should be able to access the preserved seeds and restore agricultural diversity. This is what the flood narratives describe. Atrahasis builds a boat, choosing an appropriate medium. He loads seed stock, animals, craftsmen, standardizing what must be preserved. He follows Enki's instructions, institutional knowledge transmitted across the catastrophic break. He survives the flood, physical protection through the disaster. Afterward, he restores offerings and agriculture, re-implementing the preserved systems. The narrative structure parallels preservation engineering. Identify the threat. Choose preservation medium. Select what must be saved. Follow proven procedures. Survive the catastrophe. Re-implement afterward. Whether the flood narrative describes literal history or encodes accumulated wisdom about how knowledge survives catastrophe, the pattern it teaches is functionally accurate. This is how preservation works. This is what must be done if continuity is to be maintained across discontinuity. The Antarctic ice demonstrates natural preservation. The information stored in ice cores wasn't intentionally preserved. It's simply what happens when snow accumulates annually, trapping atmospheric bubbles and chemical signatures. The ice doesn't care about preserving information, but the physics of the system results in information preservation as inevitable consequence. Cuneiform tablets demonstrate intentional preservation. The Sumerians cared about maintaining institutional knowledge. They built systems designed to preserve information across time. They succeeded. Their tablets remain readable 4,000 years later, transmitting administrative records, literary works, technical manuals, and cultural memory across a gap that swallowed the civilization itself. Both systems prove preservation is possible. Both show that appropriate medium, proper procedures, and physical protection allow information to survive across timescales that exceed individual human lives, political structures, or even languages. The question raised by the Sumerian texts is whether this principle extends further than we typically acknowledge. Can knowledge survive not just decades or centuries, but millennia? Can it cross catastrophic breaks, floods, ice ages, civilizational collapses, and remain recoverable on the far side? The tablets themselves prove the answer is yes, at least for 5,000 years. We can read Sumerian despite the language being dead for 2 millennia. We can reconstruct Babylonian astronomy, Assyrian medicine, Sumerian mathematics from tablets that survived the complete disappearance of Mesopotamian civilization. The Antarctic ice proves the answer is yes across nearly 1 million years. Ice cores recover atmospheric samples 800,000 years old, chemically unchanged, perfectly preserved, still readable through spectroscopy. If knowledge can cross 800,000 years through natural ice preservation, and if knowledge can cross 5,000 years through intentional tablet preservation, then the principle scales. The limiting factors are medium durability, encoding stability, physical protection, and eventual discovery by someone capable of reading the format. The Svalbard Seed Vault is our generation's attempt to implement this at conscious, engineered scale. We're trying to preserve across potential civilizational collapse. We're encoding information, genetic information, in seed DNA in a medium designed to survive catastrophes. We're following the blueprint the Sumerians demonstrated and Antarctica exemplifies. We don't know if it will work. The vault is only 16 years old. The test of its preservation capability requires the very catastrophes we hope won't occur. But the design is sound, the principles are proven, the medium functions, the encoding is stable, the physical protection exists, the institutional commitment is established. If catastrophe comes, the vault should persist. If future populations need the seeds, they should be recoverable. The information should cross the gap, exactly as the Eridu Genesis describes, exactly as the Antarctic ice demonstrates, exactly as the cuneiform tablets prove. Preservation is possible. Knowledge can survive catastrophe. Continuity can be maintained across discontinuity. If you choose the right medium, follow proper procedures, and provide adequate protection. The Sumerians did, the ice does. We're trying. The archives exist, subglacial and clay, natural and artificial. Both types function, both preserve, both transmit information across time. The archive beneath Antarctica preserves climate history, atmospheric chemistry, ancient Dina. The archive in museum drawers preserves Sumerian language, Babylonian astronomy, flood narratives. Both wait to be read. Both require specialised knowledge to interpret. Both reward that effort with information from before our time, before our knowledge, before our systems. Both prove that memory survives, if preserved properly, if encoded correctly, if protected adequately. The ice remembers, the clay remembers, both archives persist, and both remind us that what seems lost might only be buried, waiting beneath surface layers for someone with appropriate tools to drill down and recover what was preserved. The archives exist. The knowledge waits. The transmission is possible. We need only remember to look beneath the surface. And once there, to read carefully what the preserved records say. The problem of procedural detail. Tablet K 3375, housed in the British Museum and commonly called Tablet C of the Epic of Gilgamesh, contains approximately 300 lines describing the flood and its immediate aftermath. The tablet was discovered during Austin Henry Lard's excavations at Nineveh in the 19th century, part of the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, who ruled in the 7th century B. The text is written in Akkadian cuneiform and represents the latest version of a story that existed in Sumerian, Old Babylonian, and multiple other versions over nearly 2 millennia. What makes Tablet C remarkable among flood narratives is not the existence of the flood. That motif appears across many cultures, but the procedural specificity with which the ark's construction is described. The instructions given by Ea, the Akkadian name for Enki to Utnapishtim, the Akkadian name for the flood survivor, aren't vague divine guidance. They're construction specifications. The text states, demolish the house, build a boat, abandon possessions, seek life, reject property, save life, take aboard the seed of all living things. The boat you will build, its dimensions shall be measured. Let it be equal its width and its length. Roof it over like the apsu. Then specific measurements, 1 iku shall be her area, 10 dozen cubits the height of her walls, 10 dozen cubits the edge of the square deck. An iku is a Mesopotamian unit of area equal to approximately 3,600 square meters. 10 dozen cubits, 120 converts to approximately 60 meters. The boat described is therefore a cube, 60 meters on each edge, 7 decks dividing the interior into compartments, roofed over completely so it's enclosed rather than open-topped. The text continues with construction details. I laid down her structure, drew her design. 6 decks I gave her, dividing her into 7 parts. Her interior I divided into 9 compartments. I drove water plugs into her. I saw to the pole and laid in what was necessary. The description includes materials. 3 sah of bitumen I poured into the kiln. 3 sah of pitch I poured inside her. 3 sah of all the basket carriers brought. A sah is approximately 36 litres. The text specifies quantities of waterproofing materials measured in units that indicate careful accounting. This isn't symbolic description. This reads like a supply list from a construction project. Modern naval architects have analysed these specifications. Would a cube-shaped vessel 60 metres on edge actually float? Would it be stable? Would it survive storm conditions? The analysis, published by various engineering teams over the decades, generally concludes, yes, with caveats. A cube-shaped vessel would have enormous displacement. The volume of water it displaces would easily support the structure's weight even with considerable cargo. The low centre of gravity, heavy cargo below, lighter materials above would provide stability. The fully enclosed design would prevent swamping from waves. The vessel would pitch and roll in heavy seas but wouldn't capsize easily. It would be nearly impossible to steer no hydrodynamic shaping, massive surface area creating drag, but steering isn't necessary if the purpose is simply surviving duration of a storm. In essence, the Ark as described is a survival barge, not a ship. It's designed to float and remain intact while being tossed by storm conditions, not to navigate or make progress toward a destination. The specifications are consistent with that purpose. The cubic shape maximizes internal volume for cargo while minimizing materials needed for construction. The multiple decks separate cargo types, preventing animals from escaping, isolating incompatible species, organizing supplies for access during the voyage. The complete roofing prevents water entry. This level of technical coherence is not what you expect from pure mythology. Myths don't usually include engineering specifications that prove functional under analysis. The details are specific enough to evaluate, and when evaluated they work. Compare this to other ancient flood stories. The biblical Genesis account gives dimensions for Noah's Ark, 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high, a rectangular vessel roughly 150 metres by 25 metres by 15 metres. This produces a different shape, more ship-like, though still too large for practical ancient construction. The proportions are 6,010.6, which modern naval engineers recognise as similar to modern cargo vessels. It would float and maintain reasonable stability. Again, functionally viable specifications. The Greek flood myth involving Deucalion describes building a chest or box, but gives no dimensions or construction details. The flood lasts 9 days, a boat is built, a couple survives, but there's no procedural description. It's a story, not a manual. The Sumerian and Babylonian flood narratives contain construction manuals embedded in story format. Someone knew enough about boat construction, waterproofing, cargo management and storm survival to describe a vessel that would actually function for the purpose described. This knowledge is either drawn from actual boat building experience, adapted to fantastical scale, or it preserves memory of specifications that once referred to something real. The procedural detail extends beyond construction. The loading sequence described in Atrahasis is logically ordered, family first, then animals, and then craftsmen, then supplies, duration versions for duration. This ordering makes sense if you're actually trying to preserve the means to rebuild civilization. It's less obviously necessary if you're inventing a symbolic story about divine rescue. The text specifies 7 days and nights for the flood duration, not 40 as in Genesis, not an indefinite long time, but exactly 7 days. This precision is repeated across versions. Why 7? Possibly because that was the duration of the historical event being remembered. Possibly because 7 is a symbolically significant number in Mesopotamian culture. But the specificity suggests some constraint on the narrative. Something about the tradition required maintaining that exact number. After the boat grounds, the bird sending sequence is described procedurally. First a dove is sent, it finds nowhere to land and returns. Then a swallow is sent, same result. Then a raven is sent, it doesn't return, indicating land is available. The sequence tests conditions with progressively more capable birds. Doves prefer trees and cultivated areas. Ravens are opportunistic and can survive on carrion or harsh terrain. The logic of the test is sound. When the raven doesn't return, conditions have improved enough for generalist scavengers to survive, meaning the worst is past. This is not symbolic storytelling. This is procedure encoding, how to test whether flood conditions have abated when you can't safely exit your shelter to check directly. It's a technique that would actually work, described with enough detail to implement. The Gilgamesh text includes another striking detail. When Utnapishtim makes offerings after the flood, the gods gathered like flies over the sacrifice. This image, gods described as swarming flies, is startling in its lack of reverence, but it makes functional sense if the text preserves memory of gods depending on human offerings for sustenance. The Atrahasis explicitly states the gods were starving after the flood because no humans survived to perform agricultural labour and make offerings. When they smell Utnapishtim's sacrifice, they rush to it desperately. This detail is odd theologically. It diminishes the gods' dignity and power, suggesting they need humans as much as humans need gods. Most mythologies avoid this. Gods are typically portrayed as self-sufficient. But if the text is preserving memory of a hierarchical system where ruling specialists depended on agricultural surplus produced by managed populations, then gods starving without human labour preserves economic reality encoded in mythological language. The rulers needed the food systems maintained. The catastrophe disrupted production. When production resumed through the survivors, the rulers' food security was restored. Read this way: the texts encode practical information in mythological framework. The Ark specifications describe actual boat-building knowledge. The loading sequence describes actual preservation priorities. The bird sending describes actual testing procedure. The starving gods describe actual economic dependency. None of this proves the flood was literal global inundation, but it suggests the text preserved procedural knowledge derived from actual experience, whether experience of managing smaller floods, experience of boat construction for river transport, experience of survival preparation, or experience of post-catastrophe resource management. The alternative, that these details were purely invented by poets with no connection to practical knowledge, requires explaining why poets would include technical specifications at all. Purely literary inventions tend toward vagueness on practical detail. You say he built a great boat, not the boat had dimensions of 1 aiku in area with height of 120 cubits divided into 7 decks. The specificity suggests the detail mattered for reasons beyond narrative drama. The astronomical texts from Mesopotamia show similar procedural precision. The mole.apin tablets record star positions, heliacal risings, and planetary movements with detail that allows modern astronomers to date the observations. The tablets weren't recording mythology, they were recording observations made over centuries by specialists who tracked celestial movements as part of calendar maintenance, agricultural timing, and bureaucratic record-keeping. Mathematical texts like Plimpton 322, a clay tablet containing Pythagorean triples, demonstrate sophisticated number theory. The tablet wasn't doing philosophy or mysticism, it was working mathematics, possibly for architectural or surveying applications, using principles that indicate deep understanding of geometric relationships. Medical texts from Mesopotamia describe symptoms, diagnoses, and treatments in procedural format. If a man suffers from, you shall prepare, and he shall recover. Some treatments are superstitious. Some are herbal remedies that modern pharmacology confirms have actual medicinal properties. The format is consistent: observe, diagnose, prescribe, indicating systematic clinical approach rather than random spiritual ritual. The legal codes, Unamu, Hammurabi, and others, specify cases and remedies in conditional format, if then citizen. These aren't moral teachings in narrative form, they're procedural law designed for actual implementation in courts. Across all these genres, flood narrative, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, law, the Mesopotamian textual tradition shows the same pattern: procedural detail, technical specifications, systematic organization, precision in measurement and description. This is the written output of a literate, bureaucratic culture that documented its operational procedures. The flood narratives sit within this same tradition. They're written in the same languages, on the same medium, by scribes trained in the same schools, stored in the same archives. They contain the same type of procedural detail found in demonstrably practical texts. They use the same grammatical structures for instruction and specification. The simplest explanation is that the flood narratives, like the astronomical and mathematical and medical texts, preserve practical information, not necessarily information about a global flood, the scale might be exaggerated, but information about some actual catastrophic flooding event and the procedures that worked for survival and recovery. The specifications for the artwork when analysed. The loading sequence makes functional sense. The bird sending procedure would actually test flood conditions. The description of starving gods preserves memory of economic disruption. These aren't random inventions. They're details that cohere because they're derived from actual experience or systematic thought about actual problems. Whether the experience was literal flood survival, knowledge of major flooding events, or systematic thinking about how one would prepare for catastrophe, the texts encode procedural knowledge in narrative form. They teach while they tell. They preserve techniques while they preserve stories. This is exactly what oral tradition does in pre-literate or newly literate cultures. Essential knowledge, navigation techniques, medicinal plant identification, seasonal timing, survival skills gets encoded in narrative form so it can be transmitted accurately across generations. The story framework makes the information memorable. The procedural detail makes it applicable. The Mesopotamian flood narratives might function this way as story-encoded preservation procedures. How to prepare for catastrophe, what to preserve, how to test conditions, how to resume afterward. The framework is flood story, the content is survival manual, and because it was written down in cuneiform on clay tablets, stored in temple archives, and copied by scribes across centuries, the knowledge survived the civilization that encoded it. We can still read the Ark specifications. We can still analyse whether they would work. We can still learn the procedure for testing flood conditions with birds. The tablets taught then, they teach now. The procedural detail persists. The knowledge transmits, exactly as the texts themselves claim knowledge should transmit, through careful preservation, institutional maintenance, and encoding in durable medium. The flood narratives don't just tell a story about preservation, they are preservation. They demonstrate the principle they describe. And the procedural detail, the specifications, the sequences, the technical coherence, is part of why they survive. They weren't just entertaining, they were useful, they taught, they preserved, they transmitted knowledge. Across 4,000 years, through the death of languages and civilizations, the technical specifications in Tablet K 3375 remain readable. The arc dimensions can still be evaluated. The procedure still makes sense. The detail matters. It's why the text was preserved. It's what makes the text more than mythology. It's knowledge, encoded in narrative, transmitted through time, still readable, still teaching. The problem of procedural detail is that it's too specific to be easily dismissed, but too embedded in mythology to be easily extracted. The solution is to recognise it as both practical knowledge preserved in mythological framework, transmitted through narrative because that was the available technology for knowledge storage. Effective across millennia because the combination of story and procedure makes the information both. Memorable and applicable. The tablets are manuals disguised as myths, or myths containing manuals, or perhaps a category that doesn't separate the two, knowledge narrative, teaching story, preserved procedure as tradition. Whatever we call it, it works. The knowledge crossed time. The procedures remain intact. The specifications can still be read. 4,000 years later, we can still evaluate whether the ark would float. And the answer is yes. That precision across that duration is itself remarkable. The details solve the problem it described, how to preserve knowledge across catastrophe, by encoding it precisely enough to survive, embedding it in narrative durable enough to transmit, and writing it in medium permanent enough to outlast empires. The procedure worked. The text survives. The knowledge persists. Problem solved. 3 interpretations. 3 frameworks exist for interpreting the Sumerian texts and their relationship to Antarctic geology. First interpretation, symbolic mythology. The mainstream academic position holds that the Anunnaki are gods in a traditional religious pantheon. The flood narratives encode moral teachings about divine power and human humility. The king list's impossible chronologies are numerological symbolism, not history. The procedural details in texts like Atrahasis reflect the bureaucratic culture that produced them. Scribes naturally wrote in administrative language even when describing mythological events. Antarctica's geological history is irrelevant. Ancient Mesopotamians had no knowledge of the continent. Any apparent parallels between Sumerian Abzu cosmology and subglacial lakes are coincidence. Both describe underground water because underground water exists in many places, and ancient peoples everywhere noticed springs and wells. This interpretation is parsimonious and doesn't require extraordinary claims. The texts are valuable as religious and literary documents, but tell us nothing about lost civilizations or pre-ice Antarctica. Second interpretation, encoded philosophical wisdom. A middle position suggests the texts preserve sophisticated abstract knowledge in mythological language. The Anunnaki represent institutional memory itself, the accumulated wisdom that enables civilization. The flood narratives encode genuine survival knowledge, preparation procedures, preservation priorities, recovery protocols. The king list's vast chronologies might represent cultural epochs or knowledge system durations rather than individual lifespans. The Abzu cosmology demonstrates observation-based understanding of hydrological cycles. The texts are neither literal history nor pure fiction. They're teaching documents, encoding practical and philosophical knowledge in memorable narrative form. Antarctica remains irrelevant to Mesopotamian texts, but the pattern both represent preservation of information through catastrophic change is universally applicable. This interpretation respects both the text's sophistication and the archaeological evidence for gradual development of Mesopotamian civilization. Third interpretation, preserved memory. The alternative position argues the texts preserve distorted but genuine historical memory of pre-catastrophe knowledge systems. The Anunnaki were either an earlier advanced human culture, survivors of a previous civilizational cycle, or specialists who maintained knowledge through a catastrophic period and transmitted it to post-catastrophe populations. The flood narratives describe actual events, perhaps composite memories of multiple catastrophic floods in Mesopotamian river valleys, or possibly memory of more widespread climate catastrophe at the Younger Dryas boundary, approximately 800 BC, when rapid climate shifts disrupted early agricultural societies globally. The procedural details survive because they worked. They're preserved specifications from actual survival and recovery operations. Antarctica becomes relevant because it represents the principle the texts encode. Landscapes and knowledge can be preserved beneath surfaces, clay institutional memory across timescales that erase surface evidence. If Antarctica transitioned from inhabitable to frozen within geological timeframes that overlapped with human existence anywhere on the planet, and if any coastal interaction occurred during brief warm periods, memory of lands beyond the ice or knowledge from before the freeze might have entered mythological traditions through diffusion across cultures. This interpretation requires speculative connections but takes seriously the text's consistent claims that civilizational knowledge was inherited, not invented. Each framework has strengths. The symbolic interpretation aligns with mainstream archaeology and requires no extraordinary claims. The philosophical interpretation respects the text's sophistication while remaining agnostic on historical claims. The preserved memory interpretation honours the text's self-understanding as historical documents, but struggles with the vast temporal and geographic gaps between proposed events and textual records. Perhaps the truth combines elements of all three. The texts are mythological in literary form, philosophical in encoding practical wisdom, and historical in preserving genuine patterns, if not specific events, about how knowledge survives catastrophe. The Anunnaki might function as symbolic representation of institutional memory, while also preserving distorted memory of actual knowledge specialists who transmitted skills across a disruptive period. The flood might be theological teaching, survival manual, and composite memory of actual catastrophic flooding simultaneously. What's certain is the pattern both the texts and Antarctic geology demonstrate. Information can be preserved through catastrophic transformation if the medium is appropriate, the encoding is durable, and the storage conditions protect against degradation. Clay tablets prove this across 5 millennia. Ice cores prove this across 800,000 years. The principal scales: archives of ice, archives of clay. In December 2018, a drill breaks through 1,084 metres of Antarctic ice into hidden water. In a museum vault in London, a curator slides open a drawer containing tablet BM 78941. Both actions access archives, one frozen, one clay. Both contain information from before the surfaces above them were transformed. The Antarctic ice sealed a landscape of flowing rivers and living ecosystems beneath frozen weight. The cuneiform tablets sealed knowledge of antediluvian cities, preservation procedures, and transmission systems beneath dead languages. Both archives waited in darkness, one beneath kilometres of ice, one beneath millennia of linguistic change, until someone developed tools to read what was preserved. The parallel isn't proof of connection. Antarctic ice cores don't mention the Anunnaki. Sumerian tablets don't describe subglacial lakes. The correlation is conceptual, not evidential. Both systems demonstrate the same principle: catastrophic surface transformation doesn't destroy what lies properly preserved beneath. Antarctica transformed from temperate continent to frozen archive through geological process. Mesopotamia transformed from Sumerian through Akkadian, through Aramaic, through Arabic. Each linguistic shift burying earlier texts deeper beneath layers of changed meaning. Yet both archives remain readable to those with appropriate tools: ice-penetrating radar and genetic sequencing for one, cuneiform scholarship and linguistic reconstruction for the other. The Sumerians understood preservation. They chose clay because fire would harden it. They impressed rather than painted because impressions survive erosion. They stored tablets in foundation deposits where destruction of buildings above would protect archives below. They copied old tablets when they deteriorated, maintaining transmission chains across centuries. Their procedures worked. We read their words 4,000 years later. Nature understood preservation. Antarctic ice accumulated annual layers that trapped atmospheric bubbles, pollen, cosmic dust, volcanic ash. The layers compressed but remained distinct, creating a stratigraphic archive readable through core sampling. Subglacial lakes isolated organisms whose dinar preserved genetic information across 100,000-year gaps. The system worked. We read climate history extending 800,000 years into the past. Both archives teach the same lesson. If you want knowledge to survive, encode it in what catastrophe cannot destroy, store it where transformation will seal rather than erase, and ensure future discovery remains possible for those who develop the tools. The Sumerian texts claim the Anunnaki transmitted knowledge from before the flood. Whether Anunnaki means gods, earlier humans, or institutional memory itself, the pattern described is accurate. Knowledge from prior arrangements can survive into later arrangements if preservation is intentional and medium is appropriate. The tablets themselves prove this. They are knowledge from before, transmitted across catastrophic discontinuity of civilization collapse, readable now because preservation procedures functioned correctly. Antarctica demonstrates the same principle through geological process. Knowledge of past climate, past ecosystems, past atmospheric composition survives beneath ice because preservation conditions are optimal. The information crosses time not through intention but through physics. Cold stops decay, pressure prevents escape, isolation maintains stability. If ancient peoples understood this principle through observing their own environment, that springs emerged from hidden waters below, that knowledge came from ancestors before, that catastrophes could be survived through proper preparation, then encoding that understanding in mythological language. Makes sense. The Abzu isn't primitive error about geology, it's accurate observation that fresh water exists below surface, preserved in darkness, accessible at specific points. Whether the Sumerians knew of Antarctica specifically is unknowable, and probably not, but whether they understood the general principle that archives beneath surfaces preserve what's lost above is demonstrated by their own archival practices. They built archives, they buried knowledge, they preserved through catastrophe, they transmitted across time. 4,000 years ago, scribes pressed reed styluses into wet clay, recording knowledge they believed must be preserved. Today we drill through ice, extracting cores that preserve atmospheric knowledge from 800,000 years ago. The methods differ. The principle is identical. Both archives exist. Both wait beneath surfaces. Both reward careful excavation with knowledge from before. The mystery isn't whether such preservation is possible. The archives prove it is. The mystery is what else lies preserved beneath surfaces we haven't yet drilled through, encoded in formats we haven't yet learned to read, waiting for excavation technologies we haven't yet developed. The Sumerians knew catastrophe comes. They prepared by encoding knowledge in durable medium, storing it in protected locations, copying it across generations. They succeeded. Their knowledge survived. Antarctica experienced catastrophe, transformation from inhabitable to frozen. It preserved information through physical process, sealing landscapes, organisms, atmospheres beneath ice. The information survived. Both archives remain. Both can be read. Both teach. Memory survives, if preserved properly. Close your eyes now, wherever you are. Consider the layers beneath you, geological, historical, linguistic, knowledge buried under time waiting, archives beneath surfaces, memory in darkness. The drill breaks through ice. The curator opens the drawer. The archive yields its secrets to those who remember to look beneath the surface, to those who develop tools to read what's preserved, to those who understand that what seems lost might only be waiting, beneath ice, beneath clay, beneath time. The archives exist. The knowledge persists. The transmission continues. Sleep now. The mystery remains. Tomorrow, perhaps, another archive opens. Another voice from before speaks across the gap. Another drill touches hidden water. The pattern holds. Knowledge survives. The archives wait.